Rosalind Pemberton traveled 2,400 miles to marry a man she had never seen. She knew him only through 14 handwritten letters, a promise that she would never be alone again, and a deed to a Montana homestead with her name written beside his. When she stepped off the Union Pacific rail car at Elkhorn Bend, Montana Territory on an October afternoon in 1875, no one was waiting for her. She stood on the platform with a battered leather trunk at her feet and an envelope of letters pressed against her chest. The depot was nothing more than a plank floor under a tin roof barely wide enough for two people to stand shoulder to shoulder. A hand-painted sign read Elkhorn Bend in letters that had faded to the color of old bone. Beyond the platform, the land opened up in every direction, vast and gold and terrifying in its emptiness. Mountains rose on both sides of the valley, their peaks already dusted with early snow, and the sky stretched overhead in a blue so deep it looked like something that could swallow a person whole. She waited 1 hour, then two. The sun shifted westward and the shadows of the mountains crept across the valley floor like dark water rising. The October wind found the gaps in her navy traveling dress and pushed through with the kind of cold that does not ask permission. She pulled her shawl tighter and kept her eyes on the road that led north from the depot, watching for dust, for movement, for any sign that the man who had written those letters was coming to claim the future he had promised. Nothing came. Nothing moved. Only the wind and the grass and the slow turning of the sky. The station master, a stooped man of 70 named Hobart Neely, finally stirred from his chair inside the ticket office. He pushed open the window and squinted at her through glass so dirty it turned the light brown. His eyes moved over her the way a man reads a page he has seen before. The navy traveling dress with its lace collar told him she was from the East. The shoes too thin for Montana dirt told him she had never set foot on open ground. The cameo brooch at her throat told him she had once known better circumstances. And the way she held her trunk handle with both hands as if the wind might rip away the last solid thing she owned told him everything else. "Help you, miss? I am looking for the Calhoun Ranch. Could you direct me?" Hobart studied her for a long moment. He had been station master at Elkhorn Bend for 11 years, and in that time he had watched many people arrive at his platform with hope in their eyes and discover that Montana did not care about hope. Montana cared about endurance. Montana cared about whether you could survive the first winter without losing your mind or your fingers or your will to keep breathing. This girl with her Boston shoes and her lace collar and her envelope of letters did not look like she could survive the first night. "Calhoun Place is 8 miles north," he said. "Follow the dirt road through the pine forest. Keep the creek on your left. You will find it on the high meadow past the second ridge." He paused and rubbed his jaw with a hand that was more callous than skin. "But I ought to tell you straight, miss. The Calhoun brothers are not what you might call sociable. Judson Calhoun has not spoken more than 10 words to anyone in this town since his father died. Ransom looks at strangers like he is deciding where to bury them. And young Everett is polite enough, but it is the kind of polite that means he is reading you, not welcoming you." He let that settle. Then he added almost gently, "Whatever business you have with those men, I hope you have a plan for when it does not go the way you expect." Rosalind thanked him and paid her last coins for a rickety hired wagon from the only livery in town. The driver was a boy of 16 who did not speak a single word during the entire journey, which suited her fine. She did not want conversation. She wanted silence to think. And she wanted to read the letters one more time. As the wagon rattled north along the dirt road, she opened her envelope and spread the letters across her lap. She had read them so many times that the creases were wearing thin, the ink fading at the folds, the paper soft as cloth from the oil of her fingers. But each time she read them, she found something new to hold on to. Some phrase or detail that made her believe. The first letter had been brief, direct. The kind of letter a frontier man would write a man who measured words the way he measured fence posts, using only as many as the job required and not one more. "Miss Pemberton, I read your reply to the advertisement. My ranch needs a woman's hand. I am not a man of many words, but I am honest and I work hard. If you are interested, write back. Judson Calhoun, Elkhorn, Bend, Montana territory. The letters that followed grew longer, warmer. The writer described the ranch in language that was rough but vivid, the language of a man who saw beauty in the world around him but did not have the vocabulary to dress it up. So he described it plain and let the beauty speak for itself. Elk Creek water so clear you could count the stones on the bottom. Snow peaks that turned pink at sunrise like something painted by a hand steadier than any man's. A herd of horses running across open grassland with their manes flying like banners in a war nobody was fighting. He described daily life in the plain speech of a man who worked with his hands, rising before dawn when the saws were still sharp, mending fences in the cold while his breath made clouds that hung in the air like small ghosts, watching the sunset from the porch with a cup of coffee and a dog at his feet, and the feeling that the world, for all its hardness, was still worth the trouble of living in. He mentioned his brothers without ceremony. Ransom does not talk much. Everil reads books. The last letter had included money for the train ticket and a deed to the homestead with her name added beside his. A legal document signed and sealed granting Rosalind Pemberton co-ownership of 640 acres in the Montana Territory. And at the bottom of the letter, one line that she had read so many times she could see it with her eyes closed. I will be waiting at the depot. You will know me because I am taller than everyone else by at least a head. She folded the letters carefully and slipped them back into the envelope. The wagon lurched over a deep rut, and she gripped the seat board with both hands. Now, in the slanting gold light of late afternoon rolling through pine forests that smelled of resin and cold earth, in the particular stillness that only old trees can create, she noticed something she had missed before, or perhaps something she had chosen not to notice the way a person chooses not to notice a crack in the foundation of a house they have already decided to buy. The letters were too perfect. They said exactly what a lonely orphan girl would want to hear. The writer knew she craved family. He knew she valued intelligence. He knew she longed for a home with the desperation of someone who has never had one. The letters did not feel like a stranger reaching out blindly across 2,000 miles. They felt like someone who had studied her and written precisely what would bring her running. A chill moved through her that had nothing to do with the October air. It started in her chest and spread outward through her arms and fingers until the envelope in her hands felt less like a collection of love letters and more like evidence. But she pushed the feeling down. She pushed it deep the way she had learned to push down every inconvenient truth at St. Agnes, where the girls who survived were the girls who could swallow fear and keep walking. She had spent every cent she had on the train ticket. She had no home to return to in Boston. She had no one anywhere. The orphanage was gone, torn down 2 years ago by a company that turned children's beds into hotel rooms. The few girls she had called friends had scattered like seeds in the wind, and not one of them had written to say where they landed. Going back was not a choice. It had never been a choice. The road climbed and the trees thinned, and then the Calhoun Ranch appeared on the hillside above her, like something out of the letters brought to life. A 2-story log house stood on the high meadow, smoke curling from the chimney in a lazy gray ribbon, golden light in the windows that made the house look warm and inhabited and alive. A large horse barn flanked the house to the west, its doors open, hay visible in the loft. A chicken coop and vegetable garden sat to the east, the garden still holding the last of the autumn harvest, squash and turnips, and the dry stalks of beans that had given their final yield. Cattle grazed on the lower slopes, their dark shapes moving slowly against the gold grass like stones that had learned to walk. Horses stood in a corral behind the barn, ears pricked forward, watching her wagon approach with the alert curiosity of animals who did not see strangers often. Everything matched the descriptions in the letters. Everything was real and solid and alive, and clearly occupied by more than one person. The front door opened before her wagon reached the gate. A man stepped onto the porch, and Rosalind had to tilt her head back, then tilt it further. He was the tallest man she had ever seen, standing well over 6.5 feet, with shoulders as wide as the doorframe behind him. His hair was chestnut brown with streaks of gold, from years in the sun, thick and slightly wild, pushed back from a forehead that was broad and deeply lined for a man who could not have been older than 32. His eyes were the color of amber held up to firelight, and they held no welcome at all. Not anger, not hostility, simply the blank confusion of a man looking at something that did not belong in his world, the way a man might look at snow falling in July. Behind him, a second man appeared in the doorway. Shorter by 2 inches, but heavier in the chest, with auburn hair that caught the late sun like copper wire, and eyes the color of good whiskey. There was a stillness about him that had nothing to do with calm. It was the stillness of a loaded weapon. His hand rested near his belt, where a Colt revolver hung in a worn leather holster, and his face was a closed door with no knob on the outside. Every line of his body communicated one message with absolute clarity. He was measuring her, and he had not yet decided what she was worth. And behind them both, standing at the window with an open book in his hand, a third man. Younger, leaner, with dark blonde hair and hazel green eyes that watched her with curiosity rather than suspicion. She noticed ink stains on his fingers, the kind of stains that never fully wash out because they were replenished daily. The book was thick, leather-bound, the kind of volume a man studied rather than read for pleasure. His face had a quality of focused attention that reminded her of the smartest girls at St. Agnes, the ones who watched everything and spoke only when they had something worth saying. 3 brothers, 3 mountains of men, and not one of them expecting her. The first man spoke. His voice was deep and carried easily across the yard, the voice of a man accustomed to open spaces and few words, a voice that did not need volume to command attention because it carried authority in its very register. "Private land, miss. You have taken a wrong turn." Rosalind climbed down from the wagon. Her legs trembled from the long ride, the muscles in her thighs aching, her knees uncertain. But she locked her joints and stood straight. She was 5'3". The top of her head might have reached his collarbone. She looked up into those amber eyes and said in a voice she forced to hold steady through an act of will that cost her more than anyone watching could have known, "I have not taken a wrong turn. My name is Rosalind Pemberton. I have come from Boston. Mr. Judson Calhoun wrote to me. He invited me here." Silence. Complete silence. Even the horses in the corral stopped moving. Even the wind seemed to pause, as if the valley itself were listening. The 3 brothers looked at one another. It was a wordless exchange of the kind that only comes from a lifetime lived under the same roof, the kind of communication that does not need language because it operates on a frequency that outsiders cannot hear. The eldest tilted his head slightly. The middle one shrugged, a movement so small it barely disturbed the air. The youngest narrowed his eyes, and the book in his hand closed with a soft thud that sounded in the silence like a door shutting. The first man turned back to her. "I am Judson Calhoun, and I have never written a letter to anyone in Boston. Not once in my life." The words hit Rosalind like a fist to the stomach. She felt the blood drain from her face in a single cold wave, felt her fingers go numb around the envelope, felt the ground tilt slightly beneath her feet, as if the earth had decided to remind her that nothing in this world was solid, nothing was certain, nothing could be trusted. But she did not crumble. 6 years in the St. Agnes orphanage had taught her how to absorb a blow without falling. You could fall later in private where no one could see, never in front of strangers. Falling in front of strangers was how you became a target, and targets did not survive. "I have 14 letters," she said. Her voice cracked on the number but recovered before the crack could widen into something that might be mistaken for weakness. "Signed with your name, and a deed to this property with my name added to it. I spent 3 weeks on a train to get here." The auburn-haired brother stepped off the porch and took the envelope from her hands before she could react. His movements were quick and efficient, the movements of a man who was accustomed to taking what he needed without asking. He flipped through the letters one by one, his whiskey-colored eyes scanning each page with the focused intensity of a man reading at tracks on the ground. Then he stopped. His jaw tightened. "Judson, look at this paper." He handed a letter to the eldest brother. Judson took it, rubbed the paper between his thumb and forefinger. His frown deepened. This was thick, smooth, watermark paper. The kind of paper that nobody in Elkhorn Bend used. The kind of paper that cost money and came from institutions that had money to spend. The kind of paper that came from only one place. The youngest brother had stepped off the porch, now setting his book on the railing with the careful precision of a man who respected books the way other men respected weapons. He took the letter, held it up to the fading light, studied the watermark with eyes that were trained to notice what others missed. "High Basin Savings and Trust paper," he said quietly. His voice was softer than his brother's, more measured, the voice of a man who thought before he spoke and weighed each word on a scale before releasing it into the air. Same stock Ogden Pratt used when he sent us that fraudulent tax notice 3 months ago. Judson looked at his youngest brother. His youngest brother looked back. Neither needed to speak. The bank was behind this. But why? Why would a small-town bank forge 14 letters, create a fake deed, and lure a young woman 2,400 miles to a ranch in Montana? The question hung between them like smoke, shapeless and choking. Rosalind watched the silent exchange between the brothers. She did not understand what they were communicating, but she recognized the dynamic instantly. She had spent her childhood reading faces, measuring silences, calculating the space between what people said and what they meant. It was a survival skill sharpened by years of practice in a place where the adults who controlled your life rarely told you the truth, and the children who shared your bed would steal your food if you let them. In the orphanage, the children who could not read adults did not last long. Something was very wrong here. And these three men knew what it was. The deed, the youngest brother said, extending his hand to Rosalind. "May I see the deed?" She pulled the document from the envelope and handed it over. He unfolded it carefully, his ink-stained fingers tracing the text, the signatures, the seals. His eyes stopped on something, then something else. Then he held the deed up to the light exactly as he had held the letter. "The ink on this signature is less than 2 weeks old," he said, "but the paper has been treated to look aged, and the registration number in the corner is not from the county system. It follows an internal numbering sequence I have seen before." He looked at Judson. "On the fake tax documents." Judson's amber eyes moved from his brother to Rosalind. He studied her for a long moment. Not with suspicion exactly, but with the careful attention of a man trying to separate what was real from what was counterfeit, the way a man examines a coin he has been handed by a stranger. She met his gaze without flinching. Whatever he was looking for, she had nothing to hide. She was the most transparent thing in this valley, a woman with no secrets and no resources and no defenses except the truth. "You paid for this deed?" he asked. "I paid for the train ticket." The deed was included in the last letter. It was presented as a wedding gift. Her voice wavered on the word wedding, the word that had once meant everything to her and now meant nothing, but she pushed through. "A gesture of good faith." "How much did the ticket cost?" "Everything I had, $32. Ransom, the middle brother, let out a low sound that might have been a curse or might have been something worse. He turned and walked to the edge of the porch, staring out at the darkening valley with his hands still resting on his revolver and his jaw working as if he were chewing on words too bitter to swallow. Judson said nothing for a long time. The silence stretched out between them, measured not in seconds, but in the slow deepening of the shadows across the meadow. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter, and something in it had changed. The confusion was gone. In its place was something harder to name. Not sympathy exactly, but recognition. The recognition of one person who has been dealt a bad hand looking at another person holding cards even worse. Come inside, Miss Pemberton. It is getting cold, and I think you need to hear some things. They sat around the kitchen table in lamplight. The house was clean but sparse. A man's house. Three men's house built for function and nothing else. No curtains on the windows, no cloth on the table, no flowers or decoration of any kind. Just solid wood, solid iron, solid purpose. The kitchen smelled of coffee and pine smoke and leather and the particular absence that a house carries when no woman has lived in it for a very long time. Judson sat at the head of the table, occupying his chair the way he occupied everything else completely. Ransom stood against the wall, arms crossed, refusing to sit, his body angled toward the door in the posture of a man who always knows where the exit is. Everett sat across from Rosalind, the letters and deeds spread before him like evidence at a trial, which in a way they were. It was Everett who spoke first. He had the clearest understanding of what was happening, and he laid it out with the precision of a man building a legal case, each fact placed carefully on top of the last, like bricks in a wall. Miss Pemberton, 3 months ago, the manager of High Basin Savings and Trust, a man named Ogden Pratt, sent a rider to this ranch with a notice claiming we owed back taxes on this property. $200 due immediately or the property would be seized. We showed him our original deed of ownership signed in 1851 under the Pre-Emption Act of 1841, when our father Declan Calhoun purchased this land from the territorial government. The deed is legitimate. There are no taxes owed on property that was bought outright and never mortgaged. He paused, choosing his next words with the care of a man who understood that words like bullets could not be taken back once fired. The bank rider left, but I followed him partway to town. He stopped at the Miller Trading Post and met with a man I did not recognize. A man in an expensive suit, the kind of suit that has never seen dirt. They were laughing. I was close enough sheltered behind the woodpile to hear the bank rider say, "Give it 3 months and we will have buyers lined up for that property." Rosalind listened without interrupting. Her hands were folded in her lap, her back straight, her face composed. But inside, the pieces were already moving, clicking together in patterns she recognized. She had seen this before, not in Montana, not with land, but in Boston with buildings. Powerful people taking things from powerless people, using paper and law as weapons, because paper and law were cheaper than guns and left no blood on the floor. Since then, Everett continued, I have been collecting evidence. He gestured to the papers on the table. Fragments I found after a windstorm blew documents out of the trash behind the bank. Notes I have kept about irregularities. Conversations I overheard in the general store. Rumors about other families losing their land. Families who were told they owed taxes they did not owe and debts they had never incurred. He looked at Rosalind directly, and in his hazel green eyes she saw something unexpected. Trust, or at least the beginning of it. The cautious, tentative first step of a man who does not trust easily, but has decided that the evidence warrants the risk. Your letters were written on bank paper. Your deed uses their internal numbering system. Somebody at that bank forged 14 letters in my brother's name and lured you here. You are not a bride, Miss Pemberton. You are a pawn. The word hung in the lamplight like a moth circling the flame. Pawn. Rosalind heard it and felt it sink into her chest like a stone dropped into deep water, falling slowly, gathering weight as it fell. She had given up everything for this journey. Every dollar, every hope, every prayer whispered on a hard wooden train seat for 3 weeks straight, while the country unspooled outside the window like a ribbon being pulled from a spool. She had believed in those letters with her whole heart. She had believed that somewhere at the end of the tracks, a man was waiting who would look at her and see not an orphan, not a burden, not a charity case, but a partner, a wife, a family. And it was all a lie. Every word, every letter, Every dream she had built on a foundation of ink and paper and the desperate need to believe that someone somewhere wanted her. But Rosalind Pemberton had been lied to before. She had been lied to by the matrons at St. Agnes who said her parents were in a better place. She had been lied to by the benefactors who said the orphanage would always be there. She had been lied to by the lawyers who said the children would be well provided for when Columbia Basin Development Company bought the building and tore it to the ground. She knew what a lie felt like. She knew the exact weight and temperature of betrayal, and she knew how to survive it. She was quiet for a long time, long enough that Ransom shifted against the wall, uneasy because a woman's silence made him more nervous than a woman's tears. Tears he could walk away from. Silence demanded that he stay and wonder what was happening behind those blue eyes. Then she spoke, and her voice was flat and calm, the surface of a lake before a storm, perfectly still and infinitely deep. Show me everything you have. Every document, every note, every scrap of paper. If someone used me as a pawn, I want to see the entire board, and I want to see it before it is my turn to play. Judson, who had been watching her throughout his brother's explanation, felt something shift in his assessment. He had expected tears. He had expected the kind of collapse he had seen in women who receive bad news, the kind of emotional surrender that he had no tools to address and no experience to manage. Instead, this small woman in her dusty blue dress was looking at him with eyes that held no self-pity and no surrender. He had seen that expression before, on his own face in the mirror on the mornings after the worst nights. The expression of someone who had been knocked down so many times that they were no longer afraid of falling. Because falling was just another thing that happened, and what mattered was not whether you fell, but whether you got back up. Everett spread every piece of evidence across the table. Not just what he had shown his brothers before, but everything. The complete collection he had gathered over 3 months kept hidden under the floorboards, because he knew Judson would want to act immediately and Ransom would want to solve the problem with his fists, and neither approach would survive contact with an enemy that fought with paper instead of bullets. Rosalind went to work, and within an hour she had found 3 things that Everett had missed. First, the signatures on the fraudulent tax notice, the signature reading Ogden Pratt. Pratt was smooth and confident, written by a hand that was accustomed to signing important documents, and did so with the practiced ease of long habit. But on internal bank memoranda, the same name appeared in a shakier hand, the strokes thinner, the pressure uneven, the letters leaning at different angles as if the writer were uncertain or afraid. 2 different people were signing the same name, or one person was signing under very different circumstances. Second, the numbering system. Every property transaction document had a small code in the upper right corner written in pencil so faintly that it was nearly invisible unless you knew to look for it. Everett had noticed the codes but assumed they were random filing references, the kind of bureaucratic notation that every institution uses to keep track of paper. Rosalind arranged them in sequence and discovered they were chronological. The bank had a numbered list of target properties, and they were working through the list in order. Each code corresponded to a specific homestead, and each homestead had a status notation beside it. Some read acquired, some read in progress, some read owner deceased. Third, she found the entry that changed everything. On a torn fragment of internal bank correspondence, barely legible, water-stained and crumpled, as if someone had tried to destroy it and failed, a single line: target H7 Calhoun, property, status owner deceased, no surviving heirs, ready for distribution. She looked up from the paper. The lamplight caught the blue of her eyes and turned them almost silver. According to bank records, she said, all 3 of you are dead. The silence that followed was the heaviest thing in the room. Heavier than the log walls, heavier than the mountains outside, heavier than 24 years of living and building and fighting to hold onto a piece of ground that someone in an office had already decided belonged to them. Judson's hands clenched into fists on the table, his knuckles white, the tendons standing out like ropes on a ship in a storm. Ransom pushed off the wall, pulled his revolver, checked the cylinder with movements so automatic they seemed involuntary, then spun it closed with a sharp click. Not threatening anyone, preparing. When the threat became real, Ransom Calhoun's body responded before his mind caught up, and his body reached for a weapon the way another man's might reach for a prayer. Everett closed his eyes. Behind those lids, a mind that could recall entire pages of legal text was processing, sorting, connecting, building the architecture of understanding that would turn scattered facts into a coherent picture. "Now I understand," he said slowly, "why they sent you here. According to their records, we are dead. The property has no owner. If a breed arrives at an empty ranch and finds no one, she becomes a witness and confirming that no one lives here. They planned for you to arrive after we had been removed." Judson's voice was very low, barely above a whisper, but it filled the room the way thunder fills a valley. "Removed. Removed, eliminated, made to match the paperwork. 3 men listed as dead who inconveniently remain alive." The truth settled over them like snow, cold and quiet, and covering everything. Rosalind felt ice in her veins. She understood now. The deed in her envelope, the letters, the train ticket, they were not a romance. They were the final piece of a plan, so calculated and so cold that it made her skin contract against her bones. She was meant to arrive at a ranch whose owners had been driven out or killed and claim ownership of land whose true owners had been erased from every record that mattered. The bank would have a buyer, a deed, and a witness all wrapped in a neat package. No one would ever question it. Everett continued, and his voice carried the particular weight of a man assembling the final pieces of a puzzle he wishes he had never started. "I have been studying the other properties on their list. The families listed as owner deceased. The Hendersons lost their cattle 6 months ago. All of them died drinking from the creek. The Morrison sheep the same. 3 families in Beaver Valley abandoned their land after their wells went bad and their animals sickened. Everyone assumed it was natural. Bad water, drought, the kind of misfortune that happens on the frontier." He paused, opened his eyes, looked at Judson with an expression that was equal parts certainty and horror. "It is not natural. Someone is poisoning the water." The word poisoning landed on the table like a physical object, dense and terrible. Rosalind thought of the notation on the documents. Owner deceased. Not a record of what had happened. A blueprint for what was planned. "That is what they intend for you," she whispered. "Not just forged papers, not just false tax claims. They are going to poison Elk Creek. Your cattle will die, your land will become worthless. And when you are desperate enough to leave, they will buy what remains for nothing. And if you refuse to leave, if your cattle survive, if somehow you hold on, then the paperwork says you are already dead and dead men cannot own property." "But the timing did not work," Everett said. "You arrived before they could execute the next phase. Something delayed their plan. Perhaps the man in the suit changed the schedule. Perhaps you traveled faster than expected. Either way, you got here first, and now they have a problem." "The man in the suit," Rosalind asked. "The man I saw at the trading post 3 months ago. I do not yet know his full name or where he comes from. I know only that he gives orders and Pratt obeys them. I know he wears suits that cost more than most men in this territory earn in a year. And I know that he looked at the Calhoun Ranch on a map and decided it was his." Ransom spoke for the first time. His voice was rougher than his brother's, the voice of a man who communicated primarily through action and considered speech a waste of energy that could be better spent doing something useful. "So what do we do with her?" The question was blunt, and it was directed at Judson, not at Rosalind, as if she were a problem to be solved rather than a person in the room. Judson did not answer immediately. He stood and walked to the window looking out at his land in the darkness. The moon had risen and the meadow was silver, the mountains black against the stars. Somewhere out there on the hill overlooking the creek, his father was buried beneath a wooden cross that Judson had carved himself, cutting each letter with a knife that shook in his hands because grief had made his body a stranger to him. Declan Calhoun, who had come to Montana in 1851 with nothing but a mule and an axe and had built everything that now stood on this ground. The ranch was not just property. It was 24 years of sweat and blood and prayer. It was Declan's broken back and calloused hands. It was the winter they lost 100 cattle in the blizzard, and Judson and Ransom dug through snow for 14 hours to save what remained while Everett, 19 years old and shaking with cold, held a torch to light their way until his fingers went numb and he could no longer feel the flame. It was every fence post, every roof beam, every stone in the chimney that Declan had laid, with hands that were more scar than skin by the time he finished. And now someone in a suit from back east had decided it was his, had drawn a line through the name Calhoun on a piece of paper and written deceased beside it as if 24 years of a man's life could be erased with 3 syllables in a pencil. And she stays, Judson said without turning from the window. Ransom straightened against the wall. No, Judson turned. He looked at his middle brother with the expression that had ended every argument between them since they were children. Not anger, authority. The quiet, immovable certainty of a man who has considered every option and arrived at the only answer that makes sense. She stays. If the bank wants her gone, there is a reason for her to be here, and I will not hand them anything they want. She is a stranger. She could be working for them. It was Rosalind who answered, and she spoke directly to Ransom, meeting his hostile whiskey-colored gaze without blinking. If I were working for them, I would not have arrived with 37 cents in my pocket, one dress to my name, and a heart broken by the discovery that 14 letters were lies. But you do not need to trust my words. Trust the evidence. Ransom stared at her for a long beat. He was not used to being challenged. He was certainly not used to being challenged by a woman a foot shorter than him who weighed less than his saddle. But something in her steady gaze, something in the way she refused to look away, reminded him uncomfortably of himself. The stubbornness, the refusal to yield, the particular defiance of a person who has nothing left to lose and therefore nothing left to fear. He said nothing, but he did not argue further, and Judson took that for consent. Everett spoke the words that sealed the alliance. She found the numbering system in an hour. I missed it in 3 months. We need her mind ransom, whether you like it or not. They gave her the guest room at the end of the hall. It was small and spare with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a window facing east toward the mountains. Rosalind lay in the dark and listened to the brothers talking in the kitchen below. She could not make out words, only the rumble of deep voices, the occasional sharp note of disagreement, the longer stretches of quiet agreement. 3 men deciding what to do about a world that was trying to erase them and about the woman who had arrived uninvited in the middle of their fight. She pressed her hand against the wall, feeling the solid log beneath her palm. This house had been built by a man who intended it to last. She could feel the care in every joint, every beam, every fitted stone. And she understood in a way that surprised her with its clarity why these men would die before they let someone take it. She had never had a home, not since she was 16. And even before that, her parents' apartment in Boston had been a rented room, never truly theirs, a place where the landlord's name was on the door and the landlord's rules were on the walls. She had no land, no legacy, no place on earth where the ground knew her and her name. But she knew what a home meant. She knew it the way a starving person knows the meaning of bread, not from having it, but from the ache of its absence. She closed her eyes. Tomorrow she would face whatever came. Tonight she would allow herself one moment of grief for the future she had imagined and lost, the husband who never existed, the family that was never real, the life that had been nothing more than ink on stolen paper. She pressed her face into the pillow and let the tears come silently the way she had learned to cry at St. Agnes's, where crying out loud meant weakness and weakness meant becoming a target. When she was done, she wiped her face, straightened her spine against the mattress, and began to think. She was good at thinking. It was the only weapon she had ever owned, and no one could take it from her. Morning came cold and bright. Rosalind walked into the kitchen to find all three brothers already seated. Coffee steamed on the table, dark and strong, and filling the room with a smell that was becoming familiar. Bacon popped in a cast-iron skillet. Judson sat at the head, sharpening a knife with slow, deliberate strokes, the blade catching the morning light with each pass across the stone. Ransom cleaned his revolver with the concentrated attention of a man performing a sacred ritual, each piece disassembled and examined and oiled and reassembled with the tenderness that other men reserved for living things. Avril had the document spread before him again, a pencil behind his ear, notes scrawled in the margins in handwriting so small it looked like the tracks of insects. They looked up when she entered, three pairs of eyes, amber whiskey hazel green. She felt their collective weight like a physical force, the combined attention of three men who were each in their own way deciding what she was. "I need to tell you something," Rosalind said. She sat down without waiting for an invitation, because waiting for invitations was a luxury for people who had time, and time was the one thing none of them had. About Columbia Basin Development Company. Everett straightened. He had found the company name on one of the bank documents, but had not yet been able to identify what it was or where it came from. It was a name without a face, a signature without a hand. Until now. 2 years ago, Rosalind said Columbia Basin bought an entire block in the south end of Boston, a hospital, a school, an orphanage. They forced every institution to close, demolish the buildings, and build a hotel. The orphanage was St. Agnes. She paused, and in the pause, 22 years of loneliness and loss and survival compressed themselves into a single breath. "I grew up there. Columbia Basin destroyed my home once already, and now they are trying to destroy yours." The connection landed like a hammer blow on an anvil, sending sparks in every direction. Averill leaned forward, his mind visibly racing behind those hazel green eyes. Judson stopped sharpening his knife, the blade frozen against the stone. Even Ransom looked up from his revolver, and for the first time since she had arrived, his expression held something other than suspicion. "You are saying the same company that took your orphanage is behind what is happening here?" Judson asked. "I am saying the same company that specializes in stripping property from people who cannot fight back has now come to Montana to do it again. The letters, the fake deed, the tax notices, the poisoned water, the plan to drive you off your land. It is not just Pratt or even the man in the suit. It is a corporation with lawyers and investors and a system they have used before and will use again unless someone stops them." Everett pulled one of the bank fragments from the pile, a letter from the man he knew only as the outsider addressed to Pratt. His ink-stained finger traced the words as he read them aloud. "Dam survey complete. Elk Creek Dam confirmed through Beaver Valley. Acquire all properties along projected flood zone before December. Cost is immaterial. Results are everything." The word dam fell into the room like a stone into still water, sending ripples in every direction. "A dam," Everett said. "That is what this is about. Someone at Columbia Basin knows where a federal dam project will be built before it is publicly announced. When the dam goes up, this entire valley floods. Every acre of land along Elk Creek will be submerged under a reservoir. The government will need to buy the land, and whoever owns it, when the announcement comes, will be paid 100 times what it is worth today. They are stealing every acre they can before the announcement." Rosalind finished the thought, her voice steady and sure. "And anyone who stands in the way they remove. By paper if possible. By poison if necessary. By whatever means the situation requires." Judson set down the knife. He placed both palms flat on the table, leaned forward, and spoke in a voice that was quiet and absolute, the voice of a mountain addressing the wind. Then we do not let them. At that moment, dust appeared on the road leading to the ranch. A single rider moving fast, the horse's hooves throwing dirt behind it, in a brown cloud that hung in the still morning air like a warning written in earth. Judson was at the window in 2 strides. He recognized the horse immediately. A black gelding with a silver-trimmed saddle, the kind of animal that cost more than most families in Elkhorn Bend, earned in a year, ridden by a man who sat straight-backed in the military fashions, spine-rigid shoulders, square chin level, the posture of a man who had been trained to follow orders and had never questioned whether the orders were worth following. Cass Ryland, Judson said, bank enforcer. Ransom was already on his feet, revolver holstered, but hand resting on the grip with the easy familiarity of a man touching something he trusted more than people. Everett gathered the documents with quick efficiency and slid them into a leather case beneath the table, his movements practiced as if he had rehearsed this moment in his mind many times and was now performing it from memory. Ryland reined up before the gate. He was lean and hard-faced, a former Union soldier, with the flat eyes of a man who had seen the worst things human beings could do to one another and had decided that morality was a luxury he could not afford. His jaw was set in a permanent clench. His hands on the reins were scarred across the knuckles. Everything about him communicated a single simple message. He was a tool, and the hand that wielded him was somewhere else. He did not dismount. A man who stays on his horse is a man who intends to leave quickly, and a man who intends to leave quickly is a man delivering a message he does not want to discuss. Calhoun, Bank Manager Pratt requests your presence in town today. Matter of your property taxes. $200 owed by sundown, or the sheriff enforces the forfeiture order. Judson stepped onto the porch. He stood to his full height and let Ryland see every inch of him. 6.5 feet of muscle and bone, and the kind of stubborn determination that does not bend because it has never learned how. The morning sun was behind him, turning his silhouette into something that looked less like a man and more like a wall. We do not owe taxes. This land was purchased outright in 1851 under the Pre-Emption Act. No mortgage, no debt. Your boss knows that. Ryland's rehearsed confidence held steady. He had delivered messages like this before to people who were smaller and less dangerous than Judson Calhoun, and the script always worked the same way. State the demand, cite the authority, leave before the anger arrives. Bank says different. Sheriff agrees with the bank. Then Ryland's eyes moved past Judson and found Rosalind standing in the doorway, and his face betrayed him completely. His eyes widened, not much, a fraction of an inch, the kind of movement that most people would miss entirely. But Rosalind was not most people. She had spent her childhood learning to read the distance between what a face showed and what it hid, the way a sailor learns to read the distance between what the sky shows and what it hides. And what Ryland's face hid in that fraction of a second was recognition, not personal recognition. He did not know her name or her story or anything about the girl from Boston who had traveled 2,000 miles on a lie, but he knew her category. He knew her role in the plan. He knew she was supposed to be here, and he knew she was not supposed to be here like this, standing inside the house, standing behind Judson Calhoun, standing with the look of a woman who had already chosen her side. The girl, Ryland said, his voice losing a fraction of its mechanical control. Who is she? Judson moved his body between Ryland and the doorway, a shift so natural it might have been unconscious. But Rosalind saw it, and she understood what it meant. It meant that whatever Judson Calhoun had decided about her in the last 12 hours, whatever calculations he had run in the sleepless dark of the Montana night, the answer had come back the same way every time. She was inside the wall now, and Judson Calhoun defended his walls. Not your concern, Judson said. Ryland gathered his reins with hands that were no longer entirely steady. He had come here to deliver a simple message and receive a simple response, and instead he had found something that did not fit the plan, something that would need to be reported to someone who did not tolerate surprises. Sundown Calhoun, $200 or the sheriff comes with papers. He wheeled his horse and spurted hard down the road, leaving dust and the ghost of his fear hanging in the morning air. Ransom watched him go. He watched the way the horse moved, the way its hooves struck the ground, the angle of its approach and departure. He watched the way a man watches an animal's tracks when he is trying to determine where the animal sleeps. Then he said something that made everyone turn. That horse came from the north, not from town. He has Beaver Creek mud on his hooves. There is a camp up there. Everett stepped onto the porch. How many? Ransom did not answer the question because he did not yet know the answer, and Ransom Calhoun did not speculate. He dealt in certainties. He dealt in things he could see and touch and count. We will find out tonight. I will go after dark. Judson nodded. Then he looked at Rosalind and said something that surprised her. Something that no man she had known in her life had ever said, not at the orphanage, where her observations were called manipulative, not on the train where her intelligence was considered irrelevant, not anywhere in the long, lonely journey that had brought her to this porch on this morning. You saw it in Ryland's face. What did you read? She had not expected to be asked. The question landed on her like sunlight on a plant that had been kept too long in the dark, warming something that had been cold for years. Judson Calhoun looked at her and waited for her answer as if it mattered, as if her ability to see what others missed was not a flaw to be corrected, but a gift to be used. He knew about me, she said. He expected me to be gone by now. When he saw me still here, still inside the house, he was afraid, not of me, of what it means that I am still here. It means their plan has gone wrong, and he is going to report that to someone who does not tolerate things going wrong. Judson held her gaze for a beat longer than necessary. Something passed between them in that moment, wordless and unnamed. Not romance, not attraction. Something deeper and more dangerous. Recognition. The recognition that comes when two people who have spent their lives building walls around themselves suddenly find someone who can see through the bricks. Not because the walls are weak, but because the person looking has walls of their own and knows exactly what they are made of. Then he turned to his brothers. Tonight, Ransom scouts the camp. Everett will make 2 copies of everything. Originals go somewhere no one will find them. Copies stay in the house. He paused. And first thing in the morning, told 4 of us she'd into Elkhorn Bend. It is time we looked Ogden Pratt and his puppet Dutch master in the eye. Ransom raised an eyebrow. All 4, Miss Pemberton included. She sees things we miss. And if they plan for her to be a pawn, I would rather she be a weapon. Ransom Calhoun left the ranch at midnight, moving on foot through the pine forest with a Colt on his hip and a Bowie knife in his boot. He did not take a horse. Horses made noise. Horses left tracks in soft ground that could be read by anyone with eyes. And where Ransom was going, silence was the difference between coming home and not coming home at all. 2 years running cattle through Apache territory in the southern ranges had taught him how to move through wilderness like something that belonged to it. He placed his feet on root and stone rather than dry leaf. He traveled upwind, so his scent blew behind him into empty forest. Every 50 steps he stopped, stood motionless, and listened with his whole body. Not just his ears, his skin, which could feel the vibration of hooves through the ground. His nose, which could smell campfire smoke from 2 miles on a still night. The back of his neck, where the hair stood when something was watching him, a warning system that had saved his life more times than he could count. The forest at night was never truly quiet. Owls called from the high branches in voices that sounded like questions no one could answer. Small animals rustled in the underbrush, going about the urgent business of survival that occupied every creature in these mountains from dusk to dawn. The creek murmured in its bed of stone, speaking in a language that was older than any human tongue. Ransom cataloged each sound and dismissed it, filtering the natural from the man-made with the precision of a tuned instrument. A deer stepping on dry leaves sounds different from a man stepping on dry leaves. A branch breaking under the weight of wind sounds different from a branch breaking under the weight of a hand. These differences were invisible to most people. To Ransom, they were as obvious as the difference between sunlight and shadow. It took him 2 hours to reach the Beaver Creek camp. He had taken the long way around, climbing the eastern ridge and approaching from above, because a man who walks straight into a camp of armed strangers does not walk out again. He found a rock outcropping 30 feet above the valley floor and lay flat on his stomach, his body pressed against the cold stone, his breathing slowed to the shallow rhythm that made no visible vapor in the freezing air. What he saw made his blood go still. 12 men, 8 of them were professional gun hands. Ransom could tell by the way they sat, always facing outward, backs never turned to the tree line. By the way they kept their weapons within arm's reach, even while eating, even while sleeping, even while staring into the fire with the empty eyes of men who had long ago stopped caring about what the fire was cooking. By the way they slept in shifts, half alert, snapping awake at the crack of a branch or the shift of wind. These were not frightened townsfolk dragged into something they did not understand. These were men who sold violence the way a shopkeeper sold flour, by weight and by the job. The other 4 were locals. Ransom recognized them even in the dim firelight, even at 30 feet, even through the haze of smoke and distance. Orrin Peavy, the blacksmith, sitting apart from the others with his head in his hands, the posture of a man who was carrying something too heavy for his shoulders and too shameful to put down. Sam Tucker, who ran the feed store, staring into the fire with the hollow eyes of a man who had already sold his soul and was trying to calculate whether the price had been fair. Pete Dawson and old Ben Greer huddled together near the horses, speaking in whispers too low to carry their faces gray, with the particular shade of fear that comes from knowing exactly what you are about to do and knowing exactly how wrong it is. But it was the wagon that stopped Ransom's heart. A large freight wagon sat at the edge of camp, covered in heavy canvas and guarded by 2 men who never left its side. Not for food, not for warmth, not for any reason. They sat beside that wagon like priests beside a reliquary, and their vigilance was the vigilance of men protecting something that mattered more than their own comfort. As Ransom watched, one of the guards lifted the canvas to check the cargo underneath. The firelight caught the contents for just a moment, a single flash of amber light on metal and glass. But a moment was enough. 6 barrels, standard industrial drums, heavy gauge steel with sealed lids. And on the side of each barrel, stenciled in black letters that Ransom could read even from 30 feet above, a single word followed by a symbol that needed no translation: a skull and crossbones. Arsenic compound, industrial grade. The kind of chemical used in mining operations to extract ore from rock, and the kind of chemical that, when introduced into a freshwater creek system, would kill everything that drank from it within days. 6 barrels of poison, enough to contaminate every inch of Elk Creek from its headwaters to the valley floor. Enough to kill every head of cattle, every horse, every sheep, every chicken that drank from the creek or ate the grass that the creek watered. Enough to turn 640 acres of living productive land into a wasteland that no one would want and no one would fight for. Enough to make 3 living men match the paperwork that said they were already dead, not by killing them with bullets, but by killing everything that kept them alive. This was not a foreclosure party. This was a systematic extermination. Ransom lay on that rock for another hour, memorizing positions, counting weapons, studying guard rotations. He noted which men slept light and which slept heavy. He noted where the horses were picketed and which direction they faced. He noted the single trail that led from the camp down to the creek, a trail that had been walked recently, and often as if someone had been scouting the best place to introduce the poison into the water. Then he crept backward off the ridge, silent as the shadow he had become, and ran the 8 miles home in the dark. He reached the ranch before dawn. The kitchen lamp was burning. Everett and Rosalind were still at the table, surrounded by documents, notes, and coffee cups. They had not slept. They looked up when Ransom came through the door, and the look on his face emptied the color from theirs, the way a sudden frost empties the color from autumn leaves. 12 men, he said, pouring coffee with hands that were steady despite what they had seen. Ransom's hands were always steady. His hands were the one part of him that never betrayed what he felt. 8 professionals, 4 locals who looked like they would rather be anywhere else. Orrin Peavy, Sam Tucker Dawson, and Greer. He drank, set the cup down, and 6 barrels of arsenic. The word hung in the kitchen like the smell of something burning. Judson appeared in the doorway. He had heard. He leaned against the frame, filling it entirely the way he filled everything, and his face showed nothing. But his hands hanging at his sides slowly curled into fists. "They are going to poison the creek," Everell said. Not a question. "Every drop of water on this land," Ransom confirmed. "Cattle dead in a week, crops dead in 2. The well draws from the same aquifer. If they contaminate the source, there is no clean water for 50 miles in any direction." Rosalind spoke quietly. That is what they told people about other families. Natural causes, bad water, the kind of misfortune that happens on the frontier. She looked at the document fragment on the table, the one that read, "Owner deceased." They were not describing what happened. They were describing what they planned to make happen. Judson pushed off the door frame and walked to the window. The first gray light of dawn was creeping across the meadow. He could see the barn, the corral, the garden, the fence line he had rebuilt 3 times with his own hands. On the hill behind the house, barely visible in the half-light, the small wooden cross that marked where Declan Calhoun lay. His father, who had carried water from that creek every day for 20 years. Who had knelt beside it to wash his face after a long day's work. Who had taught his sons to fish in its pools and swim in its bends and drink from its current with cupped hands. The creek was not just water, it was the blood of the ranch. Poison the creek and you killed the land, and killing the land, it was the same as killing the family that lived on it, only slower and quieter and legal. He stood there for a long time. Nobody interrupted him. When he turned back, his face had the quality of carved granite, something ancient and weathered and absolutely immovable, something that wind and rain and time could wear at for 1,000 years without changing its essential shape. "We ride into town. Today. All 4 of us." Ransom crossed his arms. "Into the teeth of it." "Into the teeth of it, but not blind. We know what they are planning. They do not know we know. That is our advantage, and it will not last. Every hour we wait, they get closer to pouring that poison into the water." The ride into Elkhorn Bend took an hour at a steady pace. They rode in formation, a configuration that had developed without discussion because the Calhoun brothers understood tactical movement the way most men understood breathing. Judson in front eye, sweeping the road ahead, right hand free, and close to the Henry, repeating rifle in his saddle scabbard. Ransom on the left flank, watching the tree line, reading every shadow for movement, his whiskey-colored eyes cataloging each tree and bush and rock formation as either cover or threat. Averill on the right, scanning windows and rooftops with the methodical attention of a man who understood that a shooter with a Springfield rifle could kill from 600 yards if he had elevation and patience in a clear line of sight. Rosalind rode in the center on Marigold, the gentlest mare in the Calhoun string, a position of protection that Judson had assigned without discussion, and that Rosalind had accepted without argument. She understood tactical thinking, even if she had never held a gun. Protection was not a gift. It was a strategic decision. Judson needed her alive because her mind was more valuable than a 4th rifle. The town appeared below them as they crested the final hill. 1 main street, 2 rows of wooden buildings, the saloon with its faded sign, the feed store with its shuttered windows, the post office, the Methodist church, the blacksmith shop with its cold forge, and at the far end, the largest structure in Elkhorn Bend, built of quarried stone, while everything else was built of wood, standing at the end of the main street like a fist at the end of an arm, High Basin Savings and Trust. Something was wrong. Rosalind felt it before she saw it. The same instinct that had kept her alive at St. Agnes, the ability to read the temperature of a room in a single breath, now read an entire town. Elkhorn Bend was holding its breath. Shops that should have been open were shuttered. The street, which should have been busy with mid-morning trade, was nearly empty. A woman sweeping her porch saw them coming, dropped her broom as if it had turned to a snake in her hands, and vanished inside. The door slammed behind her and the sound echoed down the empty street like a gunshot. An old man sitting outside the saloon stood up from his chair so fast he knocked it over and disappeared through the back door without picking it up. Two children playing in the dirt were snatched up by their mother, one under each arm, and pulled indoors with the speed and urgency of a woman grabbing her babies from the path of a flood. "Too quiet," Ransom said. "6 horses outside the bank." Everell noted his voice carrying the calm precision of a man cataloging facts rather than feeling emotions. "Riding horses, not town stock. Look at the saddle marks. Garrison livery out of Fort Benton." Judson did the arithmetic without breaking stride. 6 here, 12 at the camp, at least 18 men. They dismounted in front of the bank. Judson helped Rosalind down from Marigold, and as his hand steadied her waist, he leaned close enough that only she could hear. His breath was warm against her ear, and his voice was low enough to live beneath the sound of the wind. "Stay near me. If shooting starts, there is a back door through the office hallway. Ransom will be waiting outside." She nodded. His hand stayed a fraction of a second longer than necessary before releasing her. Not a caress, not a declaration, just a fraction of a second in which his hands forgot to let go, as if the part of him that had been alone for 20 years was unwilling to release the only person who had ever made the loneliness bearable. She filed that away in the part of her mind that was not occupied with survival. She would think about it later. If there was a later. Inside the bank smelled of ink and old money and fear. The smell of fear was unmistakable to anyone who had grown up in an orphanage. It was the smell of sweat that has nothing to do with heat, the smell of a body preparing itself for something it does not want to face. Ogden Pratt sat behind a massive oak desk, his gray eyes cold above a 3-piece black suit that was slightly too large for him, as if he had recently lost weight or had borrowed the authority of a bigger man. His fingers tapped the desk dial in a nervous rhythm. He could not quite control the rhythm of a man keeping time with his own fear. Sheriff Wellman stood in the corner badge, glinting in the dim light, shoulders slumped, eyes fixed on the floor, with the posture of a man who had given up trying to look at himself in mirrors. 3 gun hands occupied positions around the room, casual and professional hands near holsters, eyes measuring threats with the practiced calm of men who had done this arithmetic many times before and always arrived at the same answer. And by the window, looking out at the street with his back to the room, stood a man in the most expensive suit Rosalind had ever seen outside of Boston. He turned, and Rosalind saw the face that Everell had described, the face of the man in the expensive suit, the man who gave orders that other men followed without question. Tall, well-built, with gray eyes that were sharp with intelligence and utterly empty of compassion, the bearing of a man who had never been told no and had organized his entire existence around the assumption that he never would be. His hair was dark and expensively cut. His shoes were polished to a mere shine that reflected the lamplight like black water. His hands were clean, completely clean. The hands of a man who had never built anything with them, never dug a post hole or mended a fence or held a dying calf in a blizzard. The hands of a man who destroyed things by writing his name on paper, Desmond Kincaid, the man behind the curtain, the mind behind the machine. Judson walked to Pratt's desk and placed the Calhoun deed flat on the oak surface. The original, dated 1851, bearing the seal of the Montana Territorial Government. 24 years of one family's life compressed into a single document that smelled of cedar and old ink and the particular authority that only time can grant. "Explain," he said, one word. It was enough. Pratt's mouth opened and closed. His fingers stopped tapping. Sweat appeared on his forehead like dew on glass, sudden and involuntary, the body's confession of what the mouth refused to speak. He looked at Kincaid the way a dog looks at its master when a stranger knocks on the door desperate for instruction, terrified of making a decision on its own. But Kincaid stepped forward smooth as oil on water and answered for him. His voice was cultured and measured, each word chosen with the care of a man who understood that language was a weapon more powerful than any gun, because a gun could only kill you once, but the right words could take everything you had and leave you alive to suffer the loss. Mr. Calhoun, I am Desmond Kincaid representing Columbia Basin Development Company. I apologize for any confusion. Clerical errors in property records are unfortunately common in frontier territories where the filing systems are primitive and the record keepers are often, shall we say, less than meticulous. I am sure we can resolve this like reasonable men. Judson did not move. His body was perfectly still, the way a mountain is still, and his voice carried the same weight. Clerical errors do not include forging letters in my name to lure a woman from Boston. Clerical errors do not include listing me and my brothers as deceased in your records. And clerical errors do not include stockpiling 6 barrels of arsenic 8 miles from my house, enough to poison every drop of water in this valley. The arsenic was new information. Kincaid processed it without visible reaction, his face as smooth and controlled as the surface of a frozen lake. But Rosalind, watching him with every ounce of her orphanage-trained perception, saw the micro-expression. A flicker behind the eyes too fast for anyone who was not looking for it, too brief to be called an emotion. Not fear, recalculation, the look of a chess player who has just learned that his opponent can see 3 moves further than expected and must now revise every assumption he has made about the game. I have no knowledge of any chemicals, Kincaid said evenly, but I understand your concern. Frontier life breeds suspicion. Let me make you a fair offer. $500 for the property, cash, today. Enough to start fresh wherever you choose. Everell spoke from behind Judson's shoulder, his voice calm and precise as a surgeon's blade cutting through infection to reach clean tissue beneath. Montana Territorial Statute of 1874, Section 7, Paragraph 3, land acquired before 1860 under the Preemption Act of 1841 is exempt from territorial taxation in perpetuity. Every tax notice your bank has issued to us is unlawful. Every forfeiture order based on those notices is void, and every action taken to enforce those void orders constitutes fraud under territorial and federal law. Kincaid turned his gray eyes on Everell and reassessed visibly. He had not expected legal literacy from a rancher's youngest brother. He had expected dirt under the fingernails and fear in the eyes, and the particular helplessness of uneducated men confronting the machinery of institutional power. Instead, he found ink stains and statute citations in the cool, unhurried confidence of a mind that had done its homework. He recovered in under a second because Desmond Kincaid always recovered, but the recovery itself was telling. Men who are never surprised do not need to recover. An interesting interpretation. However, Judge Trask has ruled that the 1874 statute does not apply to properties that have not been surveyed to current federal standards. Your property has not been surveyed. That ruling is legally indefensible, and you know it. Perhaps, but it is the ruling of the judge with jurisdiction. And in law, Mr. Calhoun, the ruling of the sitting judge is the law until a higher court overturns it. The nearest appellate authority is in Helena. He paused, letting the distance do its work. 3 days' ride. The message was clear. By the time they reached Helena, the poison would be in the water. The cattle would be dying. The land would be worthless. And 3 men who were already listed as dead in the bank's records would have no reason to fight for ground that could no longer sustain them. It was Rosalind who broke the stalemate. She stepped out from behind Judson, and when she spoke, every person in the room turned to look at the small woman in the dusty blue dress, who had no weapon, no badge, no authority, and no fear. Columbia Basin Development Company. Kincaid looked at her. For the first time, something in his composure shifted, not cracked, shifted. The way a building shifts before it falls, a movement so small that only someone looking for it would notice. 2 years ago, Rosalind said, Columbia Basin bought an entire block in the south end of Boston. They forced a hospital to close. They shut down a school, and they demolished the St. Agnes orphanage where I lived for 6 years, where I learned to read and write and think, where the only people who ever cared whether I lived or died tried to give me a future. Her voice did not tremble. It was the steadiest voice in the room, steadier than Kincaid's composure, steadier than Judson's granite stillness, steadier than the three gun hands who shifted their weight at the sound of it, because steady voices in dangerous rooms are the voices that change the direction of events. You took my home once, Mr. Kincaid. I watched your company tear it down brick by brick. I stood on the sidewalk and watched the walls come down, and the dust rise and the pigeons scatter from the roof where they had nested for 50 years. And now you have sent me 2,400 miles to help you steal someone else's home. She paused. Let the silence work. Silence she had learned at St. Agnes was more powerful than any words because silence forced the listener to fill the empty space with their own thoughts, and their own thoughts were always worse than anything you could say. I was supposed to be your pawn. I was supposed to arrive after you poisoned this family's water and killed their livestock and drove them off their land and find an empty ranch and a forged deed with my name on it. But I arrived early, and I can read ledgers, Mr. Kincaid. I can read them very well. Kincaid studied her for a long moment, and for the first time Rosalind saw something in those gray eyes that was not calculation or contempt. It was the cold attention of a man identifying a genuine threat, not a physical threat, not a legal threat, but something more dangerous than either. A witness, a mind, a person who understood exactly what he had done and could explain it to anyone who would listen. Miss Pemberton, Kincaid said softly, you are very young and very far from home. I advise you not to let intelligence exceed your capacity for self-preservation. Judson moved, one step forward, placing his body between Kincaid and Rosalind, and his voice came out low and quiet, the rumble of distant thunder before the storm breaks open. You just threatened her, in front of me. The three gun hands shifted their weight. Ransom outside the bank moved to a position covering the back door. Everill's hand rested on the leather case beneath his coat, where copies of the evidence waited ready to be delivered to anyone with the authority to act on them. Kincaid raised both hands and smiled the smile of a man who knows he holds the stronger cards and can afford to be gracious about it. No threats, only friendly counsel between neighbors. Columbia Basin employs 47 lawyers, Mr. Calhoun. Every one of them costs more per hour than your ranch earns in a month. The $500 offer expires at sundown. I suggest you take it. They left the bank. Outside, the street was still deserted, the shutters still closed, the town still holding its collective breath. But one door was open. Nettie Sperling stood on the porch of her general store, a woman of 60 with iron gray hair pulled back tight against her skull, a spine like a flagpole, and eyes that had seen every kind of human weakness and cowardice that a frontier town could produce, and had decided long ago that she would not participate in any of it. She beckoned them over with a quick, sharp gesture, the gesture of a woman who did not waste movements any more than she wasted words. Inside the store, speaking fast and low, Nettie gave them intelligence that changed everything. Kincaid brought 4 more men in last night, rode in after midnight. That makes at least 16 hired guns between the camp and the town. Sheriff Wellman signed the forfeiture order yesterday morning. His hand was shaking so bad he could barely hold the pen, but he signed it. It takes effect at sundown. She paused, looking at each of them in turn, measuring them the way she measured cloth by the yard with a sharp eye for flaws. And there is something else. Last night I was closing up late. Pratt and Kincaid were in the hotel hallway right outside my back wall. They did not see me in the dark. They did not think anyone was listening because men like that never think anyone is listening. Pratt asked about Miss Pemberton, what to do about her. Kincaid said, I am telling you his exact words because I have a memory that does not lose things he said. She knows too much. If she leaves Elkhorn Bend and talks to the wrong people. She drew her finger across her throat, slowly, deliberately, the way Kincaid had done it in the hotel hallway, a gesture that needed no translation in any language. Rosalind felt the information land in her body like a stone in still water. Concentric circles of understanding rippling outward from the point of impact. They wanted to kill her. Not metaphorically, not eventually, not as a contingency plan to be activated under certain conditions, specifically and soon. She was a loose thread in a garment that Desmond Kincaid had spent months weaving, and loose threads were cut. Nettie pressed a basket into Rosalind's hands. Bread, cheese, a bottle of whiskey, practical provisions wrapped in practical cloth. For courage, the old woman said. Then she pulled Rosalind into an embrace, brief and fierce, the embrace of a mother who has buried her own children and recognizes the shape of an orphan's loneliness. Because grief knows grief the way water knows water, by its weight and its depth and its refusal to be held. It was the first time a woman had held Rosalind since her mother died 6 years ago. She bit the inside of her cheek until she tasted blood, because if she cried now here in this store, she might not stop. And stopping was something she could not afford. They stepped out of Nettie's store and found trouble waiting. Two of the gun hands from the bank had positioned themselves at each end of the main street, blocking both exits from town. A third sat on horseback in front of the livery where their horses were tied. They were not drawing weapons, not yet. But their positions were deliberate, a net closing slowly designed to hold the Calhouns in place while someone decided what to do with them. Judson assessed the situation in under 2 seconds. His eyes moved from one gun hand to the next, calculating distances. Angles cover the way a man reads a landscape he might need to fight across. Back alley, behind the church, there is a trail that connects to the North Road. They move fast, not running, but walking with the controlled urgency of people who understand that running draws bullets. Ransom took the rear, walking backward, his hand on the Colt, his whiskey-colored eyes fixed on the gun hand who had started following them on foot. Everill guided Rosalind through the narrow gap between the church and the old mill, where years of neglect had created a passage barely wide enough for a horse to pass. Their mounts were gone from the livery, Judson swore under his breath, but Nettie Sperling, who had seen the gun hands move from her store window and understood immediately what it meant, had already sent her stock boy to lead the 4 horses around the back of the church. The boy, a freckled 14-year-old named Finn, stood holding the reins with shaking hands and wide eyes. Mrs. Sperling said you would need these out back, the boy whispered. They mounted fast. A shout went up from the main street as one of the gun hands spotted them rounding the church corner. A shot cracked the bullet, striking the church wall and sending a spray of whitewash into the air like a handful of thrown snow. Judson kicked his horse into a gallop, leading them up the narrow trail behind the church through a stand of cottonwoods and onto the North Road at a dead run. They rode hard for 2 miles before Judson slowed the pace. Behind them, the sound of pursuit faded. The gun hands, unfamiliar with the back trails, had lost them in the tangle of paths behind the church. Ransom checked behind them one final time. Clear, but they will know which direction we went. Judson nodded, which means they will come for us tonight instead of waiting for sundown. On the ride home, Judson moved his horse alongside Rosalind's, for the first time closing the distance he had maintained since her arrival, the careful, deliberate distance of a man who did not allow people near him because nearness was the first step toward loss, and loss was the one thing Judson Calhoun could not survive again. He said nothing, but his presence beside her, massive and solid and warm, was a statement more eloquent than any words he could have spoken. She was under his protection now. Whatever that cost him, whatever price the future demanded for the decision he had made, he had decided to pay it. Back at the ranch, they planned. This was the scene that mattered most, the moment that would determine whether everything that followed was a victory or a defeat. Four people with their backs against a wall, examining every option, discarding the ones that led to destruction, and choosing the only path that offered a chance. Judson laid it out with the direct efficiency of a man who had managed a ranch and two younger brothers through five Montana winters, and understood that planning was not about finding the perfect option, but about finding the least terrible one. Final objective: get the evidence to Territorial Marshal Yancey Braddock and Helena. Everything else is secondary. Problem, Everell said. Helena is 3 days' ride. Kincaid gave us until sundown today. 16 armed men against four of us, and 6 barrels of poison waiting to be poured into our water. Then we split our effort. One person takes the evidence to Helena, the other 3 stay here and hold them off long enough for the messenger to get clear, and long enough to keep them away from that creek. Ransom's voice was quiet. Who goes? Every eye in the room moved to Rosalind. She saw the logic before anyone spoke it. She saw it with the clarity that comes from a lifetime of reading rooms and understanding what people need before they know they need it. Everell said it first. Kincaid is looking for 3 Calhoun brothers on horseback. He is not looking for a Boston woman on a fast horse taking the back trails. Rosalind is the last person they will suspect. Judson objected, not from emotion, though emotion was there, coiled beneath the surface like a spring wound too tight. From tactical analysis. She has been riding for less than a week. She does not know the mountain trails. And if they catch her alone in the passes, she cannot defend herself. Rosalind answered him, and her voice carried the weight of 22 years of proving people wrong about what she could and could not do. I taught myself to read at 6 because no one at the orphanage thought I was worth teaching. I survived 3 weeks alone on a train across the country with $32 and a dream that turned out to be a lie. I am not strong, I am not fast, I cannot shoot, and I cannot fight, but I am not helpless, and I am the only option that gives us a chance. Judson looked at her. The lamp threw shadows across his face, deepening the lines around his eyes, the lines of a man who had carried too much for too long and was about to hand the heaviest burden of all to the smallest person in the room. She saw him weighing her life against the ranch, against his brothers, against everything his father had built. She saw the exact moment he realized she was right, and the exact cost of that realization moving through his body like a wave of cold water. Ransom, Judson said without looking away from her. Which horse? Ransom answered without hesitation. Anthem, fastest in the string, responds to leg pressure, not rein. Squeeze left, she goes left. Squeeze right, she goes right. Whistle and she runs. Do not pull hard on the reins at speed. She will stop short and throw you over her head. Talk to her. She listens. The fact that Ransom chose his best horse said more than a speech. This was a man who communicated through action, who measured care not in words but in what he was willing to give. And he was giving Rosalind the most valuable animal he owned, the horse he had trained himself, the horse he trusted with his own life. From Ransom Calhoun, there was no greater statement of faith. Before Everell began assembling the evidence package, he disappeared into the root cellar beneath the kitchen floor and returned carrying something none of his brothers had seen before. A leather-bound ledger thick as a Bible, its cover stained with smoke and age. What is that? Judson asked. Everell set it on the table. High Basin's real account book, the one Pratt keeps hidden in his office safe. The one that records every bribe, every fraudulent transaction, every payment to Judge Trask and Sheriff Wellman. Ransom leaned forward. How did you get it? The night of the windstorm 6 weeks ago. Everyone in town was dealing with damage. A tree came through the bank's back wall. Pratt was in the saloon, too drunk to notice that his fortress had a hole in it the size of a doorway. I went in through the hole before anyone could board it up. Everell opened the ledger to a marked page. He thinks he burned this when he cleaned out his safe last month. What he burned was a dummy I left in its place. Same binding, same squishage, different contents. The room was silent for 5 seconds. Then Ransom said with something very close to admiration, the closest thing to a compliment he had paid anyone in 5 years. "You little thief." Everell almost smiled. "I prefer the term evidence preservation." The ledger changed everything. It was the difference between circumstantial evidence and proof, the difference between suspicion and conviction, the difference between a case that might be heard and a case that could not be denied. Every name, every date, every dollar amount. Pratt's shaky handwriting documenting his own crimes in meticulous detail because a banker's instinct to keep records is stronger than a criminal's instinct to destroy them. And Ogden Pratt was a banker to his bones. Everell prepared the evidence package with the thoroughness of a man who understood that details were the difference between justice and failure. Original documents in the stolen ledger sealed inside a waterproof leather tube with wax. A detailed letter to Marshal Braddock outlining every crime, citing every statute, naming every participant. If Braddock was unavailable, a second letter addressed to George Aldrich, editor of the Helena Independent, a journalist who had exposed corruption in Butte and would know what to do with a story this large. If both failed, a third letter to the Territorial Attorney General's office. 3 plans, 3 chances. Everell Calhoun did not believe in leaving anything to a single point of failure. That evening, as the sun dropped toward the western peaks and painted the sky in shades of copper and blood, Judson took Rosalind to the meadow behind the house and taught her to ride mountain terrain. He sat behind her on the horse, guiding her through the basics with a voice that was patient and precise and stripped of everything except the information she needed to survive. How to grip with her thighs on steep ground, how to lean forward on ascents and back on descents, how to read the terrain through the horse's movement, feeling the shift of muscle and bone beneath her that would tell her what the ground was doing before her eyes could see it. When she nearly lost her balance on a steep descent, his arm came around her waist, steadying her against his chest. She felt his heartbeat against her back, strong and fast, faster than his calm voice suggested, the heartbeat of a man whose body was telling the truth that his voice was trained to hide. Neither of them acknowledged it. There were too many things at stake, too many lives balanced on too thin an edge for either of them to name what was happening between them. Not yet, perhaps not ever if tomorrow went wrong. When the lesson ended and he helped her dismount, his hands stayed at her waist for one breath longer than necessary. She placed her hand on top of his, just for a moment, just long enough to feel the calluses and the warmth. Then she walked inside. Judson stood in the yard and looked at his hand as if it belonged to someone else, as if it had done something without his permission, and he was not sure whether to be angry at it or grateful. From the kitchen window, Everell watched the entire scene and said nothing. But in the small notebook he carried everywhere, he wrote a single line. "First time I have ever seen Judson stand still because of someone." The last meal they shared is memorable for all the wrong reasons. Rosalind cooked. It was by any objective measure a disaster. The meat burned on one side and was raw on the other, a feat of culinary inconsistency that should have been impossible, but that Rosalind achieved with the particular talent of a woman who had never been taught to cook and was learning under circumstances that did not encourage careful attention to heat distribution. The potatoes were hard enough to use as ammunition. The biscuits could have been employed as building materials. Nobody said a word about any of it. Judson cleaned his plate. Ransom cleaned his plate. Everell smiled and said, "Fine meal, Roz." They all knew it was a lie. They all laughed anyway. And in that laughter, something crystallized between them that had been forming since the moment Rosalind stepped off that wagon 2 days ago. They were no longer strangers sharing a table. They were no longer allies of convenience bound together by a common enemy. They were something else, something that had no name yet, but was as real and as solid as the log walls around them, as real as the mountain outside the window, as real as the creek that ran silver in the moonlight, the creek that someone was planning to poison, the creek that they were going to save. After dinner, Rosalind stepped onto the porch. The Montana night was vast above her, the Milky Way spilling across the sky like a river of crushed diamonds, and the air was so cold and clean, it felt like drinking light. She could see the outline of the mountains against the stars, black shapes that looked like the shoulders of sleeping giants. She could hear the creek in the distance, murmuring its endless conversation with the stones. Judson followed her out. They stood side by side, looking up, two people who had spent their lives alone, now standing close enough to feel each other's warmth in the October cold. He spoke without looking at her. His voice was low and rough, as if the words were being pulled from somewhere deep inside him against considerable resistance, hauled up from a well that had been sealed for 20 years. When my mother left, I was 12 years old. I watched her ride away on a morning just like tomorrow will be, clear sky, cold air. She did not look back. I stood on this porch and watched until she disappeared over that ridge. He nodded toward the south, toward the dark line of the ridge against the stars. And I swore I would never let anyone get close enough to leave me again. Rosalind did not look at him either. She looked at the stars. And now, a long silence, the kind of silence that is not empty, but full of everything a man wants to say and is afraid to say and knows he must say because tomorrow might not come. Now I am afraid, but not of you getting close. I am afraid of you riding away. She turned to face him. He turned to face her. In the moonlight, his amber eyes held something she had never seen before. Not in the orphanage, not on the train, not anywhere in her 22 years of living without anyone to call her own. She saw a man who was terrified and brave at the same time in exactly the same way she was. Judson raised his hand slowly, carefully, the way a man approaches a wild horse he does not want to startle. He touched her cheek with the back of his fingers. His hand was rough and calloused and enormous, a hand that had built fences and dug wells and held dying animals in snowstorms, and the touch was as gentle as anything she had ever felt. "Come back, Roz. I will come back." That was all. No kiss, no embrace, only a touch on a cheek and a promise under the stars. But both of them knew that something had changed, something had opened, something had begun that could not be undone by distance or danger, or the terrible machinery of powerful men who wanted what was not theirs. 3 in the morning, the sky was black. The air was sharp with frost. Rosalind mounted Anthem in the ranch yard, the waterproof leather tube strapped to the saddle, Nettie's bread and cheese in the saddlebag, and somewhere she would not discover until later, a small Derringer pistol that Ransom had hidden in the saddle pouch, along with a scrap of paper in his rough handwriting. "Point at the sky. Pull the trigger. The noise will make any man think twice. R." Everil embraced her. It was brief and tight, the embrace of a man who did not often touch other people and meant it deeply when he did. "Be careful, Roz." Ransom stood apart, hands in his pockets. He did not embrace her. He did not say goodbye. He nodded once and said, "Good horse, Anthem. Bring her home safe." He was talking to the horse. That was how Ransom Calhoun said, "I care about you," without having to admit it to himself. Judson held Anthem's bridle. He looked at Rosalind for a long time as if he were memorizing her face against the possibility that he might never see it again, storing every detail in a place where time and distance could not reach. Then he released the bridle and stepped back. Rosalind urged Anthem forward into the darkness. She did not look back. If she had, she would have seen Judson Calhoun standing on the porch of his father's house, watching her until the night swallowed her completely. And she might have seen, though she could not have been certain in the dark, a glint of moisture on his cheek that he would deny until his dying day. Dawn came 4 hours later, and with it, disaster. Judson had expected the attack at sundown as Kincaid had threatened. He had prepared accordingly, barricading windows with oak planks, positioning weapons at every opening, filling water barrels, and placing them throughout the house in case fire became part of the equation. He had done everything a man could do to prepare for a fight that was supposed to come 12 hours from now. What he had not expected was that Desmond Kincaid would move the timetable forward by 12 hours. The first rider appeared at the eastern tree line at 6 in the morning, while the sky was still gray and the dew was still heavy on the grass. A single dark shape emerging from the forest, like something the night had forgotten to take with it. Then another, then 5 more, then the rest. 14 men on horseback, spreading across the meadow in a wide arc that cut off every approach to the house. Every retreat from the house, every possibility except the one Kincaid had chosen for them. Sheriff Wellman Badge, glinting in the thin light of early morning, sat on his horse at the center of the line. His face was the color of old ash. Cass Ryland flanked him, straight-backed and expressionless, a weapon in human form. 8 professional gun hands took positions behind fences, water troughs, and tree stumps, the kind of cover fighting men choose by instinct, positions that offer protection from return fire, while maintaining clear lines of sight to every window of the house. And 4 townsmen, Orrin Peavy and Sam Tucker and Pete Dawson and Old Ben Greer, lingered at the rear of the formation, their horses stamping nervously beneath riders who were even more nervous, their faces gray, with the knowledge of what they were about to do and the weight of who they were about to do it to. Judson saw them from the front window and understood immediately. Kincaid had not waited for sundown because Kincaid had realized that waiting was a risk. The girl was gone. She had ridden south in the darkness with a tube full of evidence, and if she reached Helena, if she found Braddock, if the marshal rode back with warrants in the authority of the federal government, then everything Kincaid had built would collapse. The timetable had to accelerate. The Calhouns had to be dealt with now this morning before the sun climbed high enough to light the road to Helena and the future that road led to. Sheriff Wellman called out from behind a fence post, his voice carrying across the meadow with the hollow authority of a man reading words he did not believe in, a voice that had forgotten how to believe in anything. Judson Calhoun, I have a forfeiture order signed by Judge Trask. You and your brothers have 10 minutes to vacate the premises. Judson's voice came back from behind the barricaded front window, steady and loud enough for every man in the meadow to hear, loud enough to reach the 4 townsmen in the rear, who were trying not to be here, loud enough to reach whatever was left of their conscience. I know who is out there, Wellman. I know every one of you. Orrin Peavy, your wife, brought soup to this house when my father died. She stood in this kitchen and held my hand and told me that Declan Calhoun was the finest man she ever knew. Sam Tucker, my brother Ransom, shod your horses last month and did not charge you because you said times were hard. He worked 4 hours on those shoes because he wanted them done right, because that is how Declan Calhoun raised his sons. Pete Dawson, my father, lent you the money to buy your first plow, and he never asked for it back. He said a neighbor's success was his success, and he meant it. He let the words settle across the meadow, like stones dropped in still water, each one sending ripples outward through the cold morning air. You are pointing guns at the sons of Declan Calhoun, and every one of you knows that Declan Calhoun was the best neighbor any of you ever had. Think about what you are doing. Think about who is asking you to do it. And think about whether the money Kincaid promised you is worth the weight of this on your conscience for the rest of your lives. From the upstairs window, Everell provided intelligence and a steady murmur that carried to Judson below. His voice was calm and precise, even though his left arm throbbed with each heartbeat and his face was pale from the sleepless night. 14 total, 8 professionals in cover positions south fence and west water trough. Good spacing, disciplined fire lanes. Wellman behind the big fence post, not shooting, just posturing. The 4 townsmen are in the rear. He paused, and something in his voice shifted, a note of hope buried beneath the analysis. Peavy and Tucker are not aiming at the house. Their barrels are pointed at the sky. Judson processed this instantly. 4 of the 14 were reluctant. 2 were actively refusing to shoot at their neighbors. That was a fracture line, a crack running through the enemy's formation, and fracture lines could be exploited if a man knew where to apply pressure. The first shot came from one of the professionals. A Henry rifle round slammed into the window frame 6 inches from Judson's head, sending splinters into the air like wooden shrapnel. The sound was enormous in the morning quiet, a crack that rolled across the valley and bounced off the mountains and came back as an echo that sounded like a second shot. Judson answered with 2 shots from his own. Henry placed deliberately into the fence post the shooter was using for cover. Not to kill, to inform, to communicate in the language of gunfire that Judson Calhoun knew exactly where his enemies were and could reach them whenever he chose. The battle settled into a grim rhythm. Shots came in bursts of 3 or 4, followed by long silences that were more frightening than the gunfire, because in the silences you could hear your own breathing and your own heartbeat and the sound of spent brass rolling across the floor. The professional gun hands worked methodically, probing for weaknesses, testing angles, trying to find a line of fire into the house that the oak barricades did not block. They were good. They were patient. They had done this before in other towns for other men who paid them to remove obstacles, and they approached the work with the dispassionate efficiency of craftsmen. Judson fought from the front window, conserving ammunition, making every shot count, placing each round with the deliberate precision of a man who understood that he had a limited supply of bullets and an unlimited supply of enemies. Everett fought from the upper floor with the Springfield, its superior range allowing him to reach positions the attackers thought were safe positions that were 300 yards from the house and should have been beyond effective rifle range, but were not beyond the range of Everett. Calhoun, who had spent 5 years shooting at distances that would make most men shake their heads and put their weapons down. Ransom fought the way he did, everything in motion, refusing to stay in one place, appearing at a window to fire 2 shots and then vanishing before the return fire arrived, reappearing at another window on the opposite side of the house, creating the impression that the Calhoun brothers were more numerous than they were. 3 men making the noise and the chaos and the threat of 10. It was a trick he had learned from watching Apache warriors in the Southern Territories. Men who understood that the appearance of strength was sometimes more valuable than strength itself. 20 minutes and 2 men tried to circle through the forest to the back of the house. They moved quietly, professionals who knew how to approach a target from an unexpected angle. But Ransom heard them. Not saw, heard. 5 years in Montana wilderness had given him the ability to distinguish a human footfall from a deer's at 200 yards. A deer steps with its weight distributed across a broad hoof. A man steps with his weight concentrated on a heel. The difference is subtle, a fraction of a second in the sound of impact, its slight variation in the way the leaves compress. Most people cannot hear it. Ransom could hear it the way a musician hears a wrong note in an orchestra instantly and with absolute certainty. He put a shot into the ground 3 feet in front of the lead man, close enough that the dirt sprayed his boots, and both of them retreated so fast they left their hats behind. 30 minutes in, Judson made his move. During a lull in the firing, he shouted across the meadow, his voice carrying like the bell of a church that has never once failed to ring. Orrin Peavy, Sam Tucker. I know you are not shooting at this house. I know you do not want to be here. I know you were promised money or threatened or both, and I know that the man who made those promises has never kept a promise in his life unless it served him. Put down your weapons and go home. No one will blame you, not me, not my brothers, not your geese, not your children. But if you stay and someone dies today, that blood will be on your hands forever. And forever is a long time to carry blood. 10 seconds of silence. The longest 10 seconds of Judson's life. He stood behind the barricade and listened to the silence and tried not to think about what it would mean if the silence continued, if the 4 men in the rear chose Kincaid's money over their own decency. Then Orrin Peavy, the blacksmith, stood up from behind his cover. He stood slowly, the way a man stands when every joint in his body aches and every thought in his mind is heavy. He looked at the house on the meadow, the house where he had eaten supper with Declan Calhoun, 100 times the house where Declan's wife had served him pie on Sundays, the house where he had watched 3 boys grow into 3 men. He laid his rifle on the ground, not dropped it, laid it down carefully the way you lay down something you never want to pick up again, and he walked away. He walked south toward town, toward his forge, toward the life he had almost destroyed for the price of whatever Kincaid had offered him. Sam Tucker followed. He did not lay his rifle down carefully. He threw it on the ground and walked away with the quick, jerky steps of a man who was ashamed and wanted to put as much distance as possible between himself and the source of his shame. Pete Dawson hesitated. He looked from the retreating men to the professionals, still firing calculating odds, measuring consequences, trying to find a path between two kinds of fear. Then he dropped his weapon and ran, not walked, ran, as if something was chasing him, which it was, though the thing chasing Pete Dawson was not a man with a gun, but a man's own knowledge of what he had almost done. Old Ben Greer did not even bother to drop his gun. He just spurred his horse and disappeared down the road toward town at a dead gallop, his coattails flying behind him like the flag of a country that had just surrendered. 14 became 10. 10 professionals who did not flinch at the sight of neighbors walking away. 10 men who were being paid to finish a job and intended to finish it because finishing jobs was what they did, and moral considerations were not included in their fee. And then everything changed. A bullet came through the upper window. Everill was positioned 3 feet to the left, observing through a gap in the barricade, his Springfield balanced on the windowsill, his eye pressed to the rear sight. The round punched through the oak plank that should have stopped it and grazed his left arm above the elbow. Not a killing wound, not even a serious wound by frontier standards where serious meant a bone shattered or an artery opened. But the impact spun him sideways, and blood began to flow immediately, bright red against the white of his sleeve, soaking through the fabric, dripping onto the floor in a rhythm that sounded like a clock counting down. Judson heard his brother's sharp intake of breath and the thud of the Springfield hitting the floor. Something inside Judson Calhoun, something he had kept chained and caged for 32 years, something he had built walls around and locked doors against and buried under layers of discipline and responsibility, and the daily exhausting work of being the eldest brother broke free. Rage. Not the hot, wasteful kind that makes a man stupid, that turns his muscles to water and his judgment to smoke. The cold kind. The kind that clarifies. The kind that strips away everything unnecessary, every hesitation, every doubt, every fear, and leaves behind only the essential machinery of a man who has decided that the people threatening his family will not survive the decision. He lunged for the door, intending to walk out into the meadow and settle this with his hands, if necessary with his fists, if the rifle ran dry with his teeth, if the fists were not enough. And it was Ransom who stopped him. Ransom grabbed his older brother by the shoulders and slammed him against the wall with enough force to rattle the dishes on their shelf. Listen to me. Listen. If you go out there, you die. And if you die, Everill bleeds out alone, and Roz rides 3 days for nothing. Is that what you want? Judson stared at his brother. The rage was still there, burning behind his eyes like embers in a forge, hot enough to shape iron, hot enough to consume the man who held it, if he let it. But Ransom's words reached him the way cold water reaches a fever, not by destroying the heat, but by surrounding it with something that the heat could not burn. Ransom released him and spoke with a calm that surprised them both, a calm that came from somewhere neither of them had known existed, a place beneath the anger and the guilt and the 5 years of silence that Ransom had wrapped around himself like armor. Let me go around, through the trees, flank them from the south. When you hear my shots open up on the east positions, we catch them in a crossfire, and they will think there are 10 of us. Ransom, if they see you in the open. Ransom smiled. It was the first genuine smile Judson had seen on his brother's face in 5 years, and it held something that had been missing all that time. Not recklessness, not the death wish that Judson had sometimes feared lived in his brother's heart. Purpose, the look of a man who has finally found the thing he was meant to do and is no longer afraid of the Kaidaman. I was gone when Pete died, Ransom said. I was 200 miles away running cattle through the desert, sleeping under stars. I did not care about, and he died alone on this land because I was not here to help him, because I was running from something I could not name, and while I was running, the only man who ever believed in me stopped breathing. I have carried that every day for 5 years, every single day. It is the first thing I feel when I wake up and the last thing I feel before I sleep. He picked up his rifle. I am not gone now. I am right here. And I am not leaving my brothers again. He moved toward the back door. Judson caught his arm. Come back, Judson said. The same words he had said to Rosalind, the same weight behind them, the same prayer dressed up as a command. Ransom met his eyes. I will come back. Then he was gone. Out the back door, through the woodshed, into the tree line, moving without sound through the forest he had known since childhood. Every tree was familiar. Every route was mapped in his memory. He could have run this route blindfolded, and in a way he was blindfolded because the pre-dawn forest was dark as a mine shaft, and the only light was the muzzle flash from the gun still firing at the house he had sworn to protect. 50 yards through the pines, across Beaver Creek on stones placed there by his father 20 years ago, stones that Declan Calhoun had positioned specifically so that a man could cross the creek without getting his boots wet, because Declan thought of everything and provided for needs that had not yet arisen. Up the south ridge through a gully so narrow that even the deer avoided it. And then down behind the line of professional gun hands who were so focused on the house that they never heard him coming. When Ransom's first shot cracked from the south, the effect was immediate and devastating. The gun hands had not expected fire from that direction. Their careful positions chosen to face the house left their flanks exposed. Two of them broke cover and ran before the second shot came, their professional discipline collapsing in the face of an attack from an angle they had not planned for. Judson opened fire from the front window, simultaneously laying down a withering barrage that pinned the remaining shooters between 2 points of fire. The crossfire lasted less than 3 minutes. It felt like 3 hours. When it ended, the professional gun hands were retreating across the meadow at a dead run, abandoning cover, abandoning the job, abandoning whatever Desmond Kincaid had promised them, because no amount of money is worth dying for when the man paying you is not on the field and the men shooting at you are. Cass Ryland's horse threw him when a bullet struck the fence rail beside it, and Ryland ran the rest of the way on foot, limping and cursing. Sheriff Wellman was the last to leave. He sat on his horse in the middle of the meadow alone, surrounded by the silence that follows violence, the particular stillness of a world that has just been shaken and is settling back into place. He looked at the house he had just tried to take from the sons of a man who had once been his friend. He looked at the bullet holes in the walls, at the splintered window frames, at the spent brass glinting in the morning sun like small golden accusations. Then he reached up, unpinned the badge from his chest, and let it fall into the grass. It landed without a sound, swallowed by the earth, as if the ground itself wanted to bury the shame of what that badge had been used for. He turned his horse and rode away slowly, the pace of a man who was in no hurry because he had nowhere left to go and no one left to be. Judson found Everett on the upper floor, sitting against the wall, pressing a folded shirt against his arm. The bleeding had slowed. The wound was shallow. But Everett's face was white, and his eyes, when they found Judson's, held something that went beyond pain. It's Ransom back. I am here. Ransom appeared in the doorway, breathing hard, rifle in hand, a scratch on his cheek from a pine branch that he had not felt and would not notice until someone pointed it out to him later. I am right here. The three brothers looked at one another in the dusty gunpowder-scented air of their father's house. Everett with blood on his arm, Ransom with pine needles in his hair, Judson with splinters from the window frame embedded in his cheek. They had held the line, 3 men against 14, and they had held. But Judson's eyes went to the window to the road that led south toward Helena. Rosalind had been riding for hours. If she was safe, if she reached Braddock, if the marshal came with warrants and authority, then all of this, the blood, the bullets, the fear, would mean something. If she did not make it, then they had won a battle but lost the war. Kincaid would send more men. Kincaid would pour the poison into the creek. Kincaid would try again. And eventually numbers would win, because numbers always won unless the law arrived first. Everything depended on a woman who weighed less than a saddle, who had learned to ride 3 days ago, who was somewhere in the mountain passes between Elkhorn Bend and Helena, carrying the only evidence that could end this. Judson looked at the road and did what he had not done since he was 12 years old, since the morning he watched his mother disappear over that same ridge. He prayed. Rosalind Pemberton had been riding for 10 hours when she saw the men. Three of them dismounted beside a creek in a narrow passage between two walls of red stone. Their horses drank while the men passed a canteen and spoke in voices too low to carry. But Rosalind did not need to hear their words. She recognized the type from 30 yards away, from the way they sat their saddles and the way their hands never strayed far from their belts. Professional, unhurried, paid to be exactly where they were. Kincaid had sent riders to cover the Helena Road. Of course he had. A man who planned 6 barrels of arsenic and a forged death certificate for 3 brothers would not leave the back door unguarded. Rosalind pulled Anthem behind a boulder and pressed her hand against the mare's neck, willing her to silence. Anthem stood motionless, ears pricked, as still as the stone beside her. Ransom had chosen well. This horse understood danger the way her rider was learning to understand it, through stillness and patience rather than speed. She had 2 options. Wait for them to move on, which could take hours she did not have, or take the mountain route, a goat path that climbed the eastern ridge and bypassed the creek passage entirely. Everett had described it during the ride to Elkhorn Bend, pointing out landmarks with the casual precision of a man who carried a map of the entire territory in his head. If the main trail is blocked, there is a path that climbs the east face above Eagle Pass. Steep, dangerous in wet weather, but it comes out on the other side of the ridge and connects to the Helena Road near the old mining camp. Rosalind chose the mountain. The path was barely a path at all. It was a seam in the rock face wide enough for a single horse if the horse was careful and the rider was brave or desperate. Rosalind was both. Anthem picked her way upward with the sure-footed patience of a mountain-bred animal, placing each hoof on solid stone, testing the ground before committing her weight. The drop to the left was 200 feet of open air. Rosalind leaned forward against Anthem's neck and focused on the next 10 feet of trail. Just the next 10 feet. The way she had survived the orphanage. The way she had survived the train. The way she had survived the discovery that her entire future was built on lies. One step, then the next step, then the next. Halfway up the ridge, Anthem's right rear hoof slipped on wet shale. The horse scrambled, her hindquarters swinging out over the edge, loose rock cascading into the void below with a sound like breaking teeth. Rosalind seized the mane with both hands and pressed her body flat against the horse's neck, her weight shifting forward to help Anthem find traction on the front hooves. For 3 seconds that lasted a lifetime, they hung between the trail and the abyss. Then Anthem's rear hooves found purchase on a shelf of granite, and with a tremendous heave of muscle, she lunged upward and forward onto solid ground. Rosalind was shaking so badly she could not grip the reins. She leaned against Anthem's neck and whispered into the mare's ear, words that were not really words at all, just sounds of comfort and gratitude and the raw animal relief of being alive. Anthem's ear flicked back toward her voice, and the horse blew a long breath through her nostrils, and they stayed like that for a moment, woman and animal trembling together on the edge of the world. She rode until the light was gone, and then she rode another hour in the dark, trusting Anthem's night vision and her own desperate need to keep moving. When the trail became too treacherous for even a mountain horse, she stopped in a grove of ponderosa pines on the western slope and made camp with the efficiency of a woman who had never camped before, but who learned fast because learning fast was the only talent the world had ever required of her. That night she found the Derringer, tucked into the saddle pouch she had not yet opened, small enough to fit in her palm, loaded with 2 rounds, and accompanied by that scrap of paper in Ransom's rough block letters. She read it by firelight and laughed. It was the first time she had laughed in 2 days, and the sound startled her, echoing off the stone walls of the mountain like the voice of someone she used to know. The second day brought rain. It came down in sheets, turning the mountain trail to brown mud that sucked at Anthem's hooves and made every step a negotiation with gravity. Rosalind dismounted and led the horse on foot through the worst sections, her thin Boston shoes sinking to the ankle in muck, her navy dress soaked through and heavy as armor. She fell 3 times. The third time she went down hard on her side, the leather tube jamming into her ribs, and she lay in the mud for 10 seconds staring up at the gray sky and considered the possibility that she would die out here alone in the mountains and no one would find her, and the evidence would rot in its tube and the Calhoun brothers would lose everything. Then she got up, because getting up was what she did. It was what she had always done. It was the only thing she knew how to do. The third morning broke clear and cold with frost on the ground and the sky the deep crystalline blue that only comes to mountain country after a storm has scrubbed the air clean. She saw Helena before noon. The rooftops appeared first, then the church steeples, then the railroad tracks gleaming like silver ribbons in the sunlight. She rode into Helena looking like a survivor of something terrible, which she was. Her dress was torn in 3 places and stained with mud from hem to waist. Her hair hung in tangles around a face that was sunburned and windburned and hollow with exhaustion. Her hands were wrapped in strips torn from her petticoat, the makeshift bandages stiff with dried blood from burst blisters. The territorial marshal's office was a stone building on the corner of Main and 4th. Rosalind dismounted, and when her feet hit the ground, her knees buckled. She caught herself on the hitching post, stood straight through sheer force of will, untied the leather tube from the saddle, and walked inside. Marshal Yancey Braddock was 50 years old with silver hair, steel blue eyes, and a reputation that had spread across the territory like weather. He was the one lawman in Montana that nobody could buy, not because he was incorruptible by principle alone though he was, but because he was all too smart enough to know when someone was trying. He looked up from his desk as a small woman in a ruined blue dress placed a leather tube on his desk with hands that were shaking but purposeful, and said in a voice hoarse from 3 days without adequate water, "My name is Rosalind Pemberton. I have ridden from Elkhorn Bend in 3 days. There is a man named Desmond Kincaid representing Columbia Basin Development Company who was stealing land across 3 counties, forging deeds, bribing the sheriff and judge, poisoning water supplies, to drive families from their homes and planning to destroy a family named Calhoun. Every piece of evidence you need is in this tube. And if you do not come back with me today, 3 men will lose everything their father spent a lifetime building." Braddock read the documents in silence for 5 minutes. When he reached the stolen ledger, his eyebrows rose. When he looked up, his expression had changed. "You rode from Elkhorn Bend alone, 3 days through the mountain passes." A pause. "And you had never ridden a horse before last week." Something that might have been a smile touched the corner of Rosalind's cracked lips. "My technique needs work." Braddock studied her for another moment. Then he stood, walked around his desk, took her hand in both of his and said, "Miss Pemberton, I have been tracking Columbia Basin Development Company for 6 months without enough evidence to act. You have just handed me everything I need." Within the hour, Braddock had assembled his team. 5 deputy federal marshals, each carrying arrest warrants. They rode out of Helena that afternoon, 7 riders in a column with Rosalind on Anthem at the front beside Braddock. Because she knew the trail, and because Braddock, who had spent 30 years reading people, had decided within 5 minutes of meeting her that Rosalind Pemberton was one of the most reliable human beings he had ever encountered. Back at the Calhoun Ranch, the hours bled away. The morning after the gunfight, Desmond Kincaid rode to the ranch alone. No gun hands, no sheriff, just a man on a black horse arriving at the gate as if for a social call. Judson walked out to meet him. Kincaid's tone was conversational, almost warm. "I admire you, Calhoun. Most men would have taken the money. You stood your ground against 14 armed men and you won. That takes stubbornness I respect." "This is not stubbornness. This is home." Kincaid tested the word as if tasting an unfamiliar dish. "Home. Let me offer you a different perspective. The federal dam project is coming to this valley. Within 2 years, every acre you are standing on will be under 50 feet of water. The government will buy the land at whatever price the owners demand, and the men who own that land will shape the future of this entire territory. I am offering you a chance to step aside gracefully with money in your pocket and your dignity intact. That is more than progress usually offers. Judson listened. He let every word land. Then he spoke. My father came to this valley in 1851 with a mule and an axe. He cut every tree that built this house. He cleared every acre of this meadow by hand. He dug the well, he laid the foundation, he set every stone in that chimney. When my mother left and he had 3 boys under 12 to raise alone, he did not sell. When the blizzard of 72 killed 100 head of cattle and nearly killed us with them, he did not sell. When he was crushed by a falling tree and lay dying in the mud with his sons around him, his last words were not about money or progress or the future of the territory. His last words were keep the land. He stepped forward close enough that Kincaid had to look up to meet his eyes. You talk about progress, you talk about the future, but you built your future on forged deeds, bribed judges, and 6 barrels of arsenic meant to poison the water that sustains every living thing in this valley. That is not progress, Mr. Kincaid. That is crime. And you can dress it in a $10,000 suit, but it is still crime. Kincaid held his gaze for a long time. The eviction order takes effect at sundown tomorrow. And this time I will not send hired men. I will send lawyers. Lawyers are slower than bullets, Calhoun, but they never miss. 6 hours before the deadline, Ransom came down from the ridge where he had been keeping watch for 2 days. He walked into the kitchen, poured coffee, drank it standing, and said 2 words. Dust, South Road. Judson was out the door in 2 strides. He brought the field glasses to his eyes, adjusted the focus, and looked south. A column of dust was moving along the Helena Road. Not a single rider, many riders, moving at speed with purpose. Ransom stood beside him. Could be Kincaid, reinforcements. Coming from the south, Kincaid is in town to the east. Judson counted through the glasses. 7 riders. And at the front of the column on a horse, he recognized instantly by the way it moved the fluid ground covering stride of the fastest animal in the Calhoun string, small figure in a dusty blue dress with hair the color of honey catching the afternoon sun. He lowered the glasses. His hands were not steady. His eyes were not dry. He did not care about either of those things. Judson Calhoun ran. He ran off the porch, across the yard, past the fence, down the slope of the meadow toward the road. He had not run toward anything since he was a boy. He had spent his entire adult life standing still, holding ground, absorbing whatever came at him without moving. Running towards something was a different kind of courage than standing still. It required the admission that something out there mattered enough to abandon your position for. Rosalind saw him coming. She was exhausted beyond any exhaustion she had known. But when she saw the tall figure running down the meadow, she smiled. And it was the brightest thing in the Montana afternoon. She reined Anthem to a stop as he reached her. She looked down at him from the saddle. I told you I would come back. His hands reached up and lifted her down gently, as if she were made of something precious and irreplaceable. Her legs gave way the instant her feet touched ground, and his arms caught her. She pressed her face against his chest and felt the steady, rapid beat of his heart. He held her the way a man holds the only thing that matters, carefully and completely, with both arms and all his strength. Everett arrived at a run, wrapping his good arm around her shoulders. You did it, Roz. Ransom did not embrace her. He stood apart, hands in his pockets, and said, Good horse. Then after a beat that lasted exactly as long as it took for Ransom Calhoun to decide that the moment was worth the embarrassment, Good rider. Marshal Braddock dismounted and approached Judson. Mr. Calhoun, I am Territorial Marshal Yancey Braddock. Your Miss Pemberton has provided me with sufficient evidence to arrest Desmond Kincaid Ogden Pratt and every person involved in their operation on federal charges of mail fraud, deed forgery, bribery of territorial officials, poisoning of public water sources, and conspiracy to commit murder. I have warrants, I have authority, and I have a personal interest in shutting down Columbia Basin Development Company. He nodded toward Rosalind, who was leaning against Averill, barely standing but smiling. In 30 years of law enforcement, I have never met anyone with more courage per pound. They rode into Elkhorn Bend, and the arrests were clean and methodical. Ogden Pratt was found in the bank, standing over a fire he had built in a metal wastebasket, feeding documents into the flames. When he saw the marshal's badge, he collapsed into his desk chair and began to weep. Within 5 minutes, he was offering to testify against Kincaid, against Trask, against everyone. Desmond Kincaid was found at the hotel packing his bags with the composure of a man who always had an exit strategy. When Braddock entered with 2 deputies, Kincaid adjusted his cuffs and said, "I assume you have warrants. Federal warrants, Mr. Kincaid, mail fraud, deed forgery, bribery, poisoning of water supplies, conspiracy to commit murder. And the Attorney General's office in Washington has expressed particular interest in your activities across 3 states." Something shifted in Kincaid's expression. The recognition that the game was over and had been over from the moment a 22-year-old orphan girl from Boston decided to ride a horse she barely knew through 3 days of mountain wilderness, because 3 men she barely knew were worth saving. Columbia Basin has 47 lawyers, Kincaid said. They will need more, Braddock replied. Sheriff Wellman was found at his home sitting in the dark with an empty bottle and a loaded revolver on the table. When the deputies entered, he placed his hands flat on the table, palms up. "My wife died last week. Consumption. Kincaid paid for the medicine that kept her alive for 8 months. That is why I did what I did. It does not excuse it. But I want someone to know that it was not for money." Judge Trask launched into a tirade about judicial sovereignty until Braddock placed on his desk the page from the ledger that read, "Trask, $100 per month. Favorable rulings on demand." His voice died in his throat. The town of Elkhorn Bend emerged from its hiding. A door opened. A face appeared. Then another and another. Nettie Sperling was the first to step fully into the street. She stood on her porch with her hands on her hips and watched Ogden Pratt being led in handcuffs past her window, and she smiled. The first real smile since Kincaid arrived in Elkhorn Bend. Orrin Peavy, the blacksmith who had dropped his gun during the siege, stood before Judson with his hat in his hands. "I should have said no from the beginning. You stopped when it mattered, Orrin. You put down your weapon and you walked away. That took more courage than anything Kincaid or his gun hands did." Braddock organized a special election. The town needed a new sheriff, someone who had demonstrated the courage to defy corruption. Orrin Peavy was elected unanimously, the man who had dropped his gun, becoming the man who wore the badge. In the weeks that followed, every fraudulent land transaction was declared void. Every property was returned to its rightful owner. The Calhoun deed was officially registered and placed on permanent file. The arsenic barrels were seized and destroyed. The dam project was suspended pending investigation. Columbia Basin Development Company was placed under federal scrutiny, its operations frozen in Montana and 3 other states. 3 months later, the Calhoun Ranch had changed, not the land. The land was the same, eternal and indifferent as only land can be. But the house was different. There were curtains in the windows now. White lace curtains that Rosalind had sewn herself badly with stitches that wandered like a creek finding its course. There were flowers on the porch, wildflowers she picked on her morning walks. There were books on the shelf that had not been there before, ordered from Helena by Rosalind and Averill together, who spent their evenings reading aloud and arguing about characters with the passionate seriousness of people who believe that stories matter. Rosalind had become the only teacher in Elkhorn Bend, holding classes in the back room of Nettie Sperling's store. Each morning, Justin stood on the porch and watched her go. Each evening he stood on the porch and watched her come back. He did not think about his mother anymore when he watched someone leave. He thought about Rosalind and how she always returned. Ransom had softened, though he would have denied it with considerable profanity. When Rosalind caught a cold from walking home in the rain, it was Ransom who appeared at her door with a cup of hot tea, set it on the bedside table without a word, and left before she could thank him. When she was well and tried to thank him, he said, "Do not know what you are talking about," and walked away with his ears turning red. Everill's scar became his favorite conversation piece, told differently each time with growing embellishments, until Ransom would say, "That is not what happened," and Everill would grin and say, "My scar, my story." One evening, 3 months after the arrest, the four of them sat around the dinner table. Ransom said without preamble, "House is different now." Everyone looked at him. His ears were crimson. "Better," he added, "warmer." And then he stood and walked outside because he had used his word allotment for the week. But as he passed Rosalind's chair, his hand came down on the top of her head in a brief, awkward pat, the gesture of a man who had never learned how to show affection but was trying. A year to the day after Rosalind stepped off the train in Elkhorn Bend, Judson led her to the top of the plateau behind the ranch, the place where Declan Calhoun had brought Marceline 30 years earlier. Judson did not kneel. He stood before her, filling the sky, and his voice, for the first time since she had known him, trembled. "Roz, I am not good with words. Never have been. But you rode 3 days through mountains for my family. You fought for my home when it was not your home. And every day since you have turned a house that was just walls and silence into something alive." He stopped, swallowed, continued. "I spent 20 years building a wall around myself. You broke through it in 2 days, and I do not want to rebuild." He brought out a ring, small and silver, slightly tarnished with age. Marceline's wedding ring. The ring Declan Calhoun had kept through all the years after his wife left, because he believed the ring belonged to love itself, not to the person who had failed to honor it. "This was my mother's. My father kept it until the day he died. He never stopped believing that this ring meant something even after she walked away. I think he was right. I think it means that love is worth giving even when it is hard, especially when it is hard." He held the ring out to her. "Stay with me, Roz. Be my wife. Not because of an advertisement in a newspaper or a letter someone else wrote. Because I am asking you myself. Because I love you. And I will love you every day on this land until the mountains fall down." Rosalind looked at the ring. She looked at the man. She looked at the valley below, gold in the autumn light, the creek flashing silver, the ranch standing solid on the meadow where a man named Declan had built something out of nothing, and 3 brothers had fought to keep it. "Yes," she said, one word, the only word that mattered. Judson lifted her off the ground and turned in a slow circle, holding her as if she weighed nothing, laughing a sound so unexpected and so full that it echoed off the mountains and came back to them doubled. She held onto his shoulders and laughed with him, and for one perfect moment, on the top of the world, 2 people who had been alone for far too long were free. The wedding took place the following spring in the small Methodist church. The entire town attended. Nettie Sperling served as matron of honor at 60 and wept more than the bride. Averill read a poem he had written for the occasion. It was by universal agreement not very good. But it was so honest that half the congregation had to use their handkerchiefs, and Ransom, standing beside Judson as his witness, turned his face to the wall for a full 30 seconds and pretended to examine the woodwork. When the minister asked, "Who gives this woman?" Ransom and Averill stepped forward together. Each took one of Rosalind's hands, and they answered in unison, "We do." Because in the years since she had arrived at their gate with 14 false letters and a broken heart, they had become her brothers. Not by blood, by choice, by fire and gunpowder and the quiet, stubborn, daily work of learning to trust. On the evening after the wedding, Judson and Rosalind stood on the porch. Inside, Ransom and Averill argued over a hand of cards with the comfortable aggression of brothers who would fight about anything because fighting was how they said I love you. Crickets sang in the meadow grass. The Milky Way arched overhead like a bridge between the mountains. Rosalind leaned back against Judson's chest, his arms around her, his chin resting on the top of her head. The letters, she said softly, the ones someone forged in your name. The last one promised I would never be alone again. Judson's arms tightened around her. Turns out that was the one promise that came true. I will keep it every day. The lamplight glowed through the white lace curtains. Outside the land that Declan Calhoun had bought with his sweat and defended with his life, the land that his sons had held against fraud and poison, and the terrible machinery of greed lay quiet under the stars. And in the house on the meadow, a family that had been built not from blood, but from courage, not from paper, but from trust, settled into the particular peace that comes only to those who have fought for something and won. The mountain stood watch. The creek ran silver in the moonlight, its water clean and cold and safe. And somewhere in the great turning dark of a Montana night, the future opened like a door.